If we go back out there, we die too. She's a Grayson. Her father's people can come find her." Ethan Walker stared at the chaperone who just said that out loud, and then he reached for the rope. "Stop right there, because what this man just decided is going to cost a 19-year-old girl her life, unless one poor farm boy that everybody in that town looked down on does the one thing no adult in that room had the courage to do. If this story moves you even a little, take 1 second and subscribe, follow all the way to the end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels." Now into the storm. The chaperone said it a second time slower, like maybe Ethan hadn't heard him right the first time. "She's not our responsibility, son. Not in this weather." Ethan Walker heard him fine. That was the problem. There were 11 of them crammed into that little ranger warming hut, students and 2 adults, and every single one of them had gone quiet the way people go quiet when somebody says a thing they all secretly agreed with, but nobody wanted to be the one to say. Ethan looked around at those faces, kids he had gone to school with his whole life, kids who'd called his boots manure kickers that very morning, and he watched them stare at their own frozen fingers so they wouldn't have to look at him. "Say her name," Ethan said. The chaperone blinked. "What? You keep saying she. Say her name." "Walker, sit down, and Lily." Ethan's voice cracked on it, and he hated that it did because he needed it to sound like iron, and instead it came out like a boy's. "Her name is Lily Grayson, and she is somewhere out in that, and you're standing in a heated room deciding she can die because you're scared of her daddy's motorcycle jacket." Somebody in the back sucked in a breath. The chaperone, a heavy-set man named Dale Pruitt, who taught woodshop and coached JV, and had never in his life been talked to like this by a 20-year-old in a coat with a torn elbow, went red from the collar up. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Then tell me I'm wrong," Ethan said. "Tell me you did a head count before you closed that door." Silence. That was the first thing that broke Ethan clean open, that silence, because it told him everything. Nobody had counted. In the panic of the crash and the scramble uphill through the whiteout, in the relief of getting a door shut behind them, nobody had stopped to count 11 heads and realized there should have been 12. They'd left her, and they hadn't even had the decency to mean to. She'd fallen out of their attention the same way she fell out of every conversation, every lunch table, every group photo. Lily Grayson had spent her whole life being invisible, and now being invisible was going to freeze her to death, and the grown men in charge were relieved. "How long?" Ethan said. "Son, how long has she been out there?" The other chaperone, a young substitute named Ms. Reyes, who couldn't have been more than 3 years older than the seniors, finally spoke, and her voice was shaking. "The bus went off the road maybe 40 minutes ago. We hiked up. I don't..." She pressed her knuckles to her mouth. "Oh God. Oh my God, we left her on the bus. She was in the back. She was always in the back. She was always in the back." Ethan felt those words go into him like a nail. He knew exactly what she meant. He'd been sitting 3 rows up. He'd seen Lily get on that bus at 6 in the morning with her hood up and her chin down, seen her take the very last seat, the one nobody fought over, the one you only sat in if you had nobody to sit with. He'd almost said something to her. He'd almost turned around and said, hey, just one dumb word, and he hadn't, because he was tired and cold and worried about his own family, and he figured a girl like that wouldn't want to talk to a boy like him. And now he was the only one in the room standing up. Pruitt. Ethan's hands were already moving. There was a coil of climbing rope hung on a nail by the door orange, the kind rangers keep for exactly this. He took it down. "Where's the closest radio?" "There's no radio, the line's down. That's why we can't..." Dale Pruitt cut himself off and shifted his weight between Ethan and the door. And that shift, that little body block, told Ethan the man wasn't scared of the storm. He was scared of what happened after. He was scared of being the adult who let a girl die and having to explain it. He'd rather she never be found at all. "You go out in that, you don't come back. Then I've got 2 of you. I am not signing off on..." "You're not signing off on anything," Ethan said. "I'm 20. I'm not one of your students. I'm the hired help, remember? You told me that this morning." That landed. Ethan watched it land, because that was what Pruitt had told him this morning. Ethan Walker wasn't on this trip as a student. He'd graduated 2 years back. He was here because the school paid a small stipend for a young able body to help load gear and shovel steps and haul coolers, and the Walker family needed $40 the way a drowning man needs a plank. Dale Pruitt had handed him a shovel at dawn and said, "Keep up and keep quiet, and we'll get you paid." The hired help, the poor kid, the one whose daddy got hurt and whose farm was going under, and who'd take any humiliation you dished out as long as there was money at the end of it. Well, the hired help was the only one reaching for the rope. "You give me one flashlight in 40 minutes, Ethan said, wrapping the rope over his shoulder and across his chest the way his grandfather had taught him, "and I don't care what you sign." A boy named Cody Bishop, the same Cody who'd flicked a wad of paper at the back of Ethan's neck 2 hours ago, spoke up from the corner, and his voice didn't have any meanness in it now. It had the small, scared honesty that comes out of teenagers when the world stops being a joke. "Ethan, man, it's white out there. You can't see your hand. You'll get 20 feet and you'll be gone too." "Then I'll tie off," Ethan said and held up the rope. "That's what this is for." "Tie off to what?" Ethan looked at the doorframe. Solid pine bolted into a stone footing. He looped the rope's end around it twice and cinched it down with a knot his grandfather had made him tie 100 times in the dark of the barn, blindfolded until his hands knew it without his eyes. "A knot you can't tie in the dark is a knot you don't know," the old man used to say. "And the dark is exactly when you'll need it." His grandfather had been dead 4 years. Ethan's hands remembered him anyway. "I follow the rope out," Ethan said mostly to himself, now mapping it. "Downhill back toward the road toward the bus. If she moved downhill. Cold makes you go down, always down. That's what he told me. I find her. I follow the rope back. The rope is the way home. As long as I've got the rope, I've got the way home." Miss Reyes stepped forward. Her face was wet. "I'll come with you." "No, I can't just. You've got 10 kids in this room and one flashlight left after I take mine," Ethan said gentler now, because she was the only other person who'd said Lily's situation out loud. "Somebody's got to keep them warm and keep them here and keep them counting. You count okay every 10 minutes, you count heads. You don't lose anybody else. That's your job. That's more important than mine." She stared at him. Then she nodded, and something passed between them, a kind of respect that Ethan Walker had gone 20 years without receiving from a single adult in that town, and it had to show up now in a shack in a blizzard from a substitute teacher who'd known him for 6 hours. He turned to the door. "Walker." Pruitt's voice again, but different this time. Not blocking. Something cracked in it. "If you," the man swallowed, "if you find her, if she's," he couldn't finish it. "Then it'll be because I looked," Ethan said, "and not because you told me to." And he opened the door, and the storm reached in and grabbed him. "Shwam, here is a thing about the cold that people who've never truly been in it do not understand. It does not feel like cold at first. It feels like anger." Ethan stepped out and the wind hit him broadside, and it didn't chill him. It shoved him hard like a bigger kid on a playground, like it had a grudge. His breath was ripped out of his mouth before he could use it. His eyes watered instantly, and the tears froze on his lower lashes, and he had to blink like a man coming up out of water. He got both hands on the rope. "The rope is the way home. As long as I've got the rope, I've got the way home." He started down. It's a strange, terrible thing to walk into nothing. There was no down and no up, no ground and no sky, just a roaring gray-white that pressed on every side, and the only real thing in the entire universe was the coil of orange rope paying out through his gloved fists. He walked with his shoulder into the wind and his head down and his boots feeling for the slope, and every few steps he'd stop and yell, "Lily!" The wind ate it, took the word out of his mouth and threw it back over his shoulder and buried it. Lily Grayson. Nothing but the roar. 20 steps. 30. The rope was going tight behind him. Good, that meant he was moving in a straight line downhill toward the road. 40 steps. His face had stopped hurting, and Ethan knew enough to be scared by that, because a face that stops hurting is a face that's starting to freeze. And after the face, it's the hands, and after the hands, it's your thinking. And once your thinking goes, you sit down in the snow and you feel warm, and you never get up. His grandfather had told him that. His grandfather had also told him something else. The thing Ethan had never told a living soul. The thing that was walking through the storm right beside him now, whether he wanted it there or not. Because this exact thing was how his father had gotten hurt. 4 winters ago, a different storm, a different mountain, a neighbor's boy lost in the same kind of white. And Tom Walker, Ethan's father, 38 years old and strong as a fence post, had gone out into it because that's what you did. That's what a man did. You didn't leave a child in the cold. He'd found the boy. He'd brought the boy back alive. And on the way down in the dark, a slope that wasn't there in the daylight gave way under Tom Walker's feet. And he fell 20 feet onto rock and shattered his hip and his leg in 4 places. And he had lain there in the snow with a broken body and a saved child until the search party found them both at dawn. The boy lived. Tom Walker never walked right again. And that was the beginning of the end of the Walker farm. The surgeries, the bills, the months a strong man spent flat on his back watching his fields go to seed the loans. The second loans, the letter from the bank that was sitting on the kitchen table right now with a foreclosure date printed on it in a font that didn't care. Everybody in town knew that story. And here is the ugly secret shape of how a town's mind works. They pitied the Walkers for it, and pity given long enough curdles into contempt. Poor Tom broke himself for somebody else's kid. Poor family. Should have known better. Charity cases. The Walker boy, you know the one. The quiet one, the poor one. Did you hear his daddy's about to lose the whole place? Ethan had grown up inside that story. He'd grown up being the son of the man who ruined his family being a hero. And somewhere down deep in a place he never let the daylight touch, Ethan had made himself a promise: I will never be that stupid. I will never throw my own life away for someone else's and leave nothing behind but a debt. He'd promised himself that. And now here he was in the exact same storm, on the exact same kind of mountain, doing the exact same thing for a girl he had never once spoken to. Lily, he screamed, and this time it came out wrong, came out broken because he was arguing with a dead man in his own head. I'm not you. I'm not doing what you did. I'm smarter than you were. He gripped the rope so hard his hand cramped. I've got the rope. You didn't have the rope. I learned from you. He kept going down. And that was when his boot found something that wasn't snow. It was the bus. Ethan nearly walked into the side of it before he saw it. The huge dark wall of it looming out of the white tilted at a sick angle where it had slid off the road and hung up on the tree line. The windows were dark, the doorbell hung open, drifting snow already piling up the steps. His heart went up into his throat. Lily. He hauled himself up the steps. The inside of the bus was a wreck. Bags thrown everywhere, shattered window seats knocked crooked and empty. He went down the aisle screaming her name, checking under every seat, throwing bags aside. And the whole time a voice in his head was chanting, "She's here. She has to be here. She went back to the bus. She'd go somewhere she knew, and she wasn't there." The last seat, her seat was empty. There was a scarf on the floor, pale blue. He picked it up. And then he saw the back emergency door. It was open. Not knocked open, opened. Somebody had pushed the release from the inside and gone out the back down into the trees away from the road. Ethan's stomach dropped because that was the worst possible thing. She hadn't stayed put. She hadn't waited in the one place a rescuer would think to look. She'd gone off into the woods downhill away, and Ethan knew exactly why, and the knowing of it made him sick. She'd gone looking for them. She'd woken up alone on a wrecked bus in a blizzard, and she'd realized every other human being she'd been with had left without her, and she had not sat down to wait for help. Because Lily Grayson at 19 years old did not believe help was coming for her. She had never in her life had one single reason to believe that help was coming for her. So she'd gotten up and she'd gone out into a storm to try and save herself, because she was the only person she'd ever been able to count on. Ethan stood in the back door of that bus with a blue scarf in his fist, and he understood her completely. All at once, this girl he'd never spoken to, and something in his chest broke wide open and turned into fuel. "Okay, don't," he said out loud to nobody to her. "Okay, I'm coming, you hear me?" He looked back at the rope. He'd reached the end of it. 40, 50 feet all paid out, the last of it looped over his shoulder. The rope reached the bus and no further. Beyond the back door, there was only the woods and the white, and no rope at all. The rope is the way home. As long as I've got the rope, I've got the way home. If he let go of the rope, he had no way home. Ethan stood there for what felt like a year and was probably 4 seconds. He thought about his father on his back in the front room. He thought about his mother's face. He thought about the letter on the kitchen table. He thought about the promise he'd made himself: I will never be that stupid. And he thought about a girl going out into the dark alone because she'd learned that nobody comes for her. Then he tied the end of the rope to the handle of the emergency door hard, that same blind knot his hands knew in the dark, so that whoever came for the bus would find a rope leading off into the trees and know which way to follow. He wrapped Lily's blue scarf around his own wrist, and he stepped down off the back of that bus off the end of the rope into the woods with no way home at all. He was doing the exact thing that had destroyed his family, and he had never once in his life been more sure of anything. The woods were worse. In the open, the wind at least came from one direction. In the trees, it came from everywhere, funneled and swirling, throwing snow off branches in white avalanches, and the ground was a mess of buried roots and hidden holes that grabbed his ankles. He fell twice in the first 100 feet. The second time, he went down hard on his knee, and the pain was clean and bright, and he almost laughed because pain meant he could still feel, and feeling was good. Feeling meant he was still alive enough to be scared. Lily. He had worked out a system. He'd yell, then count to 5, then listen. Yell, count, listen. He forced himself to do it even though every part of his body screamed to just keep moving, generate heat, don't stop. Because if she answered and he was mid-stride, mid-yell, he'd never hear her. And the whole thing came down to whether he could hear her. Lily Grayson, it's Ethan, I'm looking for you. Count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Nothing. The roar. He picked a downhill line and followed it because cold makes you go down, always down. He tried to think like her. She's cold. She's scared. She's been walking a while. She's exhausted. Her thinking's already going. Where does a person like that end up? Not on the open slope. The wind would drive her off it. In the trees then. Somewhere the wind is a little less. Somewhere she could sit. His grandfather's voice. When they stop moving, they look for a wall. A rock, a fallen tree, a bank. Something at their back. Find the walls. Ethan started looking for walls. Lily, count. 1, 2. He heard it. He wasn't even sure he heard it. It was so small, so swallowed that it might have been the wind doing an imitation of a human sound the way wind does. But it came from his left and down, and it wasn't a word. It was just a sound, a thin, high sound, and every hair on Ethan's body stood up. Lily! He wheeled toward it. Lily, make noise, make any noise, hit something, I'm here. He plunged toward where it had come from, and he was running now, or doing the closest thing to running you can do in 3 feet of snow, falling and getting up and falling, and he was yelling her name over and over, Mom, so she'd have something to move toward too, so they'd find each other in the middle, and there she was. She was down against the base of a big deadfall, a whole toppled tree, the root ball rearing up at her back like a wall. She'd found her wall. Some animal part of her had known to find the wall, and she was curled so small, so tight, knees to her chest, and her lips were gray, and her eyes were half open and glassy, and she was so far gone she couldn't lift her head. The sound she'd made was her boot heel kicking weakly against a root. She'd heard him. She'd been trying to kick. Oh no, 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 no. Ethan hit his knees in front of her and got his hands on her face, and it was so cold. Her skin was so cold, colder than skin should ever be, and still be a person. Lily, Lily, hey, look at me. Look at me. I got you. You hear me. I got you. Her eyes rolled toward him. There was almost nobody home behind them, but her cracked gray lips moved, and what came out in a whisper he had to put his ear against her mouth to catch was the single most heartbreaking sentence Ethan Walker had ever heard in his life. You came back, she whispered, for me. Somebody came back. And then her eyes closed. No. Ethan grabbed her shoulders and shook her once hard. No, you don't. You don't get to close your eyes. Lily, Lily, open your eyes. Right now, you open them. You look at me. Her eyes cracked open again. Just barely. There you go. There you go. Stay with me. You stay looking at me. Okay, you don't look anywhere else. Just me. He was already pulling his coat off his own coat, the only real coat he had, and wrapping it around her, tucking it, cinching it, moving fast. His grandfather's voice roaring in his ears. Now get them off the ground. The ground steals more heat than the air. Get them off the ground. Put something between them and the ground. Wrap the core first, always the core. The arms and legs can wait. Wrap the chest and the belly. You said somebody came back. That's right. Somebody came back. And guess what? More people are coming. A lot more. You just got to hold on till they get here. Can you do that? Can you hold on? Her lips moved. No sound. I need words, Lily. I can't let you sleep, and I can't let you go quiet, so you gotta give me words. Anything. Tell me anything. Tell me his mind grabbed for something, anything. A thread to keep her talking, keep her here. Tell me your dad. Tell me about your dad. Grizzly, right, Mason? Tell me one thing about him that nobody in that town knows. One thing they got wrong. And that reached something in her that the cold hadn't gotten to yet. Her eyes focused. Just a hair. Just enough. Everybody's scared of him, she breathed. Yeah, keep going. Why are they wrong? A long, terrible pause. Ethan was hauling branches over now one-handed, never letting go of her, building the wall higher, breaking off pine boughs and jamming them into the gaps of the deadfall to make a roof moving faster than he'd ever moved in his life, while his own bare arms went numb in the wind. He braids my hair, Lily whispered. Ethan went still for half a second. He's got these hands, she said, and there was the smallest ghost of something in her voice, something warm buried way down under all that cold. Big, scary hands. Everybody sees the hands and they cross the street. And when I was little and my mom left, he learned to braid my hair. From a video, he sat there with his big, scary hands and a phone, and he practiced on a doll till he could do it. So I wouldn't go to school looking. Her breath hitched. Like nobody loved me. Ethan's throat closed up. He kept building. He didn't trust his voice. That's the man everybody's scared of, Lily whispered. A man who taught himself to braid hair so his little girl wouldn't feel alone, Ethan finished very quietly. Alone, she breathed. And Ethan Walker, kneeling in the snow with his coat gone and his arms freezing, and a stranger's whole broken heart in his hands, understood in that moment that he and this girl he'd never spoken to had been living the exact same life in two different houses. Both of them the child of a father who broke himself out of love. Both of them raised in the long, cold shadow of a town that had already decided who they were. Both of them so used to being nobody that when somebody finally came, the first thought wasn't, thank God it was for me. Lily, he said, listen to me. Look at me and listen. Her eyes found his. I know exactly who you are, Ethan said. Not the biker's daughter. Not the scary girl. You. And I'm not letting you go. Not tonight. Not on this mountain. Your dad braided your hair so you'd never feel alone. And I'll be damned if you're going to die out here feeling it. You are not alone. Do you understand me? You are not alone. A tear ran out of the corner of her eye and it froze halfway down her cheek. And she nodded just barely, just a fraction. And that fraction of a nod was the most alive she'd been since he found her. Good, Ethan said, and his own voice broke and he let it. Good, now, keep talking. Tell me more, tell me everything. Because I'm going to need you talking for a real long time. And when your dad gets here, and he is coming, Lily, he is coming, I want you awake to see his face. Tisfo. What Ethan did not know, what he could not have known, kneeling in that shelter with his arms around a freezing girl, was that 40 minutes earlier and 11 miles down the mountain, a phone had rung in a low cinder block building on the edge of town, and a man named Mason Grayson had answered it. And a school administrator's shaking voice had told him there'd been an accident, the bus was off the road. They'd gotten most of the kids to a ranger station, and they were fairly sure his daughter was among them, but the storm had taken the phone lines and they couldn't confirm, and Mason Grayson had set the phone down very, very gently, which was more frightening than if he'd thrown it. Fairly sure, he'd repeated. Around him, a dozen men had gone quiet. These were the men the town crossed the street to avoid. Leather and grease and hard miles and harder faces. The Hells Angels of that county, Mason's brothers, and every one of them had watched Grizzly Grayson raise that girl from a baby, had held her when she was small, had stood in a row at her school plays looking like a wall of thunder and clapping harder than any parent in the room. Say it again, said a man they called Preacher. They lost my daughter on the mountain, Mason Grayson said, and they're fairly sure. He stood up. Roads are closed, someone said. State Patrol's got the pass shut. Nobody's going up there tonight. Mason Grayson pulled his gloves out of his back pocket and started working them onto his big scarred hands. The same hands that had learned to braid a little girl's hair from a video, so she wouldn't feel unloved, and when he spoke, it was very soft, and it was the softest and most terrible thing any of them had ever heard him say. Then we don't take the roads. And up on the mountain in a shelter made of a dead tree and pine boughs in a poor farm boy's only coat, Lily Grayson opened her eyes one more time and looked at the stranger who'd come back for her, and she asked him a question in a voice like a thread about to break. "Why?" she whispered. "You don't even know me. Everybody knows about my dad. Everybody stays away. So why would you—" Her breath caught. "Why would you throw your whole life away out here in this for a girl you never even said hello to?" Ethan Walker held her a little tighter, and he thought about his father on his back in the front room, and the letter on the kitchen table, and the promise he'd broken the second he tied that rope to a bus door and walked off the end of it, and he found he wasn't sorry. He found that some promises are made to be broken, and that the boy who'd made that promise years ago had been trying to protect himself from the one true thing he now understood he'd been for all along. "Because I know what it feels like," Ethan said, "to be the one everybody leaves behind." He pulled the pine boughs closer against the wind. "And nobody," he said, "nobody should have to be alone in the storm." The cold had stopped hurting. That was the thing Ethan knew to be most afraid of. He'd been out here long enough now that his arms had gone from burning to numb to something that wasn't anything at all, and the nothing feeling was climbing up toward his shoulders like a slow tide coming in. He still had his flannel underlayer, still had his boots, still had his gloves, but he'd given Lily his coat 20 minutes ago, and 20 minutes in this storm was 20 years, and his core temperature was doing something he didn't want to think too carefully about. He kept talking. That was the only thing he had. He kept talking because she needed noise, needed the constant human sound of another voice to keep her brain from wandering off somewhere warm and fatal. And he kept talking because if he stopped talking, he'd start thinking about his own body, and thinking about his own body right now wasn't something he could afford. "My grandfather," Ethan said, shifting his arm around her shoulders to keep the shelter wall from pressing her against the snow, "built our barn himself. Took him 3 summers. Every board, every nail. He'd get up before the sun and he'd swing a hammer until it got too dark to see, and then he'd eat whatever my grandmother put in front of him and sleep 4 hours and do it again." Lily's eyes were open. He could see them in the dark, barely the faint shine of them. "People in town said he was crazy," Ethan said. "Said the same thing about my dad. Said the same thing about me, probably so. At least we're consistent." Her lips moved. He leaned closer. "What did they say?" she breathed. "About you?" "That I'm a poor kid who doesn't know when to quit." He paused. "I'm choosing to take that as a compliment tonight." Something moved in her face. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the shadow of one, the memory of what a smile felt like. "Tell me something," Ethan said. "Something true. Something you never told anybody." For a long moment, she didn't say anything, and he thought she'd slipped again, thought the warmth was pulling her somewhere else, and he was about to say her name like a command. But then she spoke, and her voice was steadier than it had been, like the act of deciding to say something had pulled her 3 degrees back from the edge. "I got into college," she said. Ethan blinked. "What?" "2 years ago, full scholarship, art school, out of state," she breathed. "In, out, like each breath was a decision. I didn't tell my dad for 3 weeks. I kept the letter in my bag and walked around with it, and every time I thought about telling him, She stopped. "Why didn't you tell him?" "Because he would have let me go." Her voice broke on the last word just barely. "He would have said yes and sold his bike and driven me there himself and come back to an empty house and never said one word about it being hard. And I couldn't—" Another breath ragged. "He'd already lost my mom. He wasn't going to lose me to some college in another state and come home every night to a house that was just him." Ethan sat with that for a moment. "So you stayed," he said. "I stayed. Flat. Not sorry, not resentful, just true. And I don't regret it. But sometimes I think about who I might have been, in some other version of things. If I'd just been someone's regular kid with a regular dad and nobody crossed the street when they saw us coming." Her breath was steadier now. The talking was working. Who might I have been if they'd given me the chance to just be me? "I think about that too," Ethan said. She looked at him then, actually looked. "Farmer's kid," she said. "Farmer's kid." He agreed. "Except we might lose the farm. So maybe just kid." "Where do you go then if you lose it?" "Don't know." The honesty of that sat in his chest like a cold stone. "My dad can't work. My mom's been picking up shifts at the diner since October. The bank's got a date on the paperwork. He shifted against the wind. Funny thing is, I had chances too. Coach wanted me to walk on at the state school. Said I had the arm for it. But somebody had to stay and run the equipment, and the somebody with the fewest options was me. He paused. Not complaining, it's just what it is. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What's your arm like?" "What? Football? What were you, quarterback, wide receiver?" "You fast was." He almost smiled. "Less so now that I've been doing tractor work for 3 years." "My dad loves football," she said, and it was so small and so random that it almost broke something in Ethan the way she reached for her father in that moment. He watches every game. Every game. He's got this beat-up recliner that's basically a holy relic at this point, and nobody is allowed to sit in it during a game or he gives them the look. The look. The look, she confirmed. Grizzly Grayson's look could stop a train, but you should see him when his team scores. He jumps up and he does this thing with his arms. She lifted one hand weakly and moved it like she was showing him, like a little kid every time. Doesn't matter what quarter, doesn't matter by how many points. Every single score he does the arm thing, and then he looks over to see if I saw. "Does he know you always look?" "Every time," she said softly. "Every time." Ethan pressed his back harder against the deadfall, adjusting his position to block more wind, and the movement sent a cascade of snow off the branches overhead. And for 1 second, the cold hit him like a wall, and he gasped, and Lily's hand found his arm. She gripped him. In her state, that half-frozen grip was probably the most effort she'd exerted in an hour, and it was aimed at him at making sure he was still there, and Ethan felt it go all the way down through him, like a current. "You okay?" she asked, and there was something almost funny about that, about the freezing, half-conscious girl asking the boy without a coat if he was okay. Something so human and honest, it bypassed all the terror and landed straight in the chest. "I'm good," he said. "Liar. I'm very good. Your teeth are doing a thing. That's just character." Her grip loosened but didn't let go entirely. Her fingers stayed against his arm, and neither of them remarked on it, and that contact, that thin thread of connection and all that cold and dark was the most important thing in Ethan Walker's world for the next 3 minutes. "What's your mom like?" Lily asked. The question surprised him, not the words, but the shape of it, the way she was doing. The same thing he'd been doing, keeping him talking, keeping both of them present, both of them doing the same job for each other without agreeing to. "She's the strongest person I know," Ethan said, and he meant it with no reservation, the way you mean the few truest things you ever say. "She cried once when my dad came home from the hospital. Once, in the car before they came inside so he wouldn't see. I was in the window upstairs and I saw her sitting in the driver's seat and I watched her fall completely apart for about 30 seconds. He paused. "And then she wiped her face and got out of the car and went in and made him dinner, and she hasn't cried in front of any of us since." Lily was very quiet. "She doesn't sleep enough," Ethan said. "She works doubles twice a week. She's got 3 different jars in the kitchen where she puts loose change, and every time one fills up, it goes towards something. New hose fitting for the equipment, propane. She never says what it's for. She just fills the jars." "She sounds like my dad," Lily said. "Yeah." Ethan thought about that. "Yeah, she does. People doing the whole job because they love somebody and they don't know how else to say it." "Why don't we ever see that?" Lily said. "About people. Why does it take all this?" She gestured vaguely at everything around them, at the cold and the dark and the impossible situation, to make you actually see somebody. Ethan didn't have an answer for that. He thought about it for a long time, listening to the storm work itself against their shelter, feeling her breathing slow down from the shallow, panicked thing it had been when he'd found her towards something more regular, more human. "Maybe it's easier to see people," he said finally, "when there's nothing left to pretend about." She absorbed that. "That's either very smart," she said, "or the cold's getting to your brain." "Definitely one of those," he said, and that time she did almost smile. He felt it more than saw it, the slight release of tension in the shoulder, pressed against his arm, the way her breathing changed for just a second. It wasn't much, but it was a 20-year-old girl who'd been left alone in a blizzard, choosing consciously, actively, to find something almost worth a smile in the presence of the one person who'd come back for her, and to Ethan Walker, it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever felt. He needed to get her warmer. The shelter was doing its job. The pine boughs overhead were catching the worst of the snow, and the deadfall was blocking the main body of the wind, but doing its job in a Montana blizzard meant not quite killing them immediately. And that wasn't a sustainable standard. She needed more insulation underneath her, needed to get her off the ground. And he needed to do something about the gap on the northeast side where the wind was still finding them every few minutes and making itself at home. He started moving without warning her, and she made a small, sharp noise when his arm shifted away. "I'm here," he said immediately. "Right here, not going anywhere. I need to fix this wall, okay? I need you to keep talking while I do it." "About what?" "Anything. What's your favorite thing? What's the thing you'd want right now if you could have anything?" A pause. He was on his knees pulling at a branch, working it into the gap with both hands. "Hot chocolate," she said. "Not the packet kind. My dad makes it from scratch. Uses actual chocolate, actual milk. This tiny pinch of cayenne. Cayenne. He saw it in a movie once, some chef thing. He tried it and he was so proud of himself, you'd think he'd won a James Beard Award." Her voice was more alive now. The memory was doing something. "He makes it every first frost of the year. Doesn't matter what time it is. Doesn't matter if I'm asleep. He knocks on my door, and he's standing there with 2 mugs, and he says." She stopped. "What?" Ethan said. "What does he say?" "He says, 'Frost came, baby girl. Get up, frost came.'" Her voice went very soft. "Like it's an event. Like it's something worth celebrating, the first frost, like the world tipped into winter, and we've got to mark the moment, or it doesn't count." Ethan worked the branch into place. The gap tightened. The wind dropped by half on that side. "That's a good dad," Ethan said. "He's the best dad," Lily said, and her voice cracked, and this time she let it. "He doesn't know where I am right now, and she swallowed. "I know him. I know exactly what he's doing right now. He's not sitting down. He doesn't sit down when I need him. He's moving," Ethan said. "He's coming," she said, and it wasn't a question. "He's already coming. He doesn't know how or where or through what, but he's already coming, and he won't stop, and I just need to—" Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "I just need to still be here when he gets here." Ethan got back to her side. He pulled his arm back around her shoulder, and he said with every ounce of certainty he had, "You will be." She nodded. Not a small fraction this time. A real nod. A decision. They sat for a while without talking, and the storm didn't care. The storm kept doing what storms do. Enormous and indifferent and terrifyingly beautiful, in the way that things are beautiful when they're larger than human beings are supposed to survive. And Ethan Walker counted his own heartbeats because it gave him something to do, and also because as long as he could count them, he knew they were still happening. Then Lily said, "You never told me why your family might lose the farm. I told you about the loans. You told me the facts. I want to know why it makes you look the way you look when you talk about it." Ethan turned toward her slightly. "What do I look like?" "Like it's your fault." She said it without cruelty, just clearly the way you can say things clearly when you're in the dark and exhausted and there's no room left for social softening. Like you think if you'd just done something different, it wouldn't be happening. He was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather built that barn himself," he said. "Told you that. 3 summers, every board. There's a beam in the back corner," Ethan said slowly. "He carved our name into it. Walker's, just that. Not dates, not a quote, not anything fancy. Just the name on the oldest beam in the place." He exhaled. "If we lose the farm, somebody will probably tear down the barn, and the beam will go with it." "And you think that's your fault?" Lily said. "I think I was the one who was supposed to prevent it and didn't." "How old are you?" 20. "You're 20 years old," she said very precisely, "and you believe it's your personal failure that your family is struggling after your father was badly hurt doing something brave in a system that doesn't give people like you any room to fail." She paused. "That's not your fault, Ethan. That's just the shape of the world being unfair." He couldn't speak for a second. "You're pretty sharp," he managed, "for somebody I found half frozen under a tree." "I've had a lot of time to think about the shape of the world being unfair," she said, dry as sand. "Comes with the last name. Grayson." "Grayson?" She said her own name like she was turning a rock over in her hand, examining it. "You know what my name does in this town? It walks into a room before I do and rearranges everything. Teachers, coaches, other parents, and they've already decided. Before I say a word, before they look at my grades, before they find out, I volunteer at the animal shelter every Saturday morning. You do. Every Saturday, 7 to noon. A small beat. I mostly do intake, lost animals, the ones that come in scared. Another beat barely perceptible. I'm good with the scared ones. Of course you are, Ethan thought. Of course. The point, Lily said, is that I walk in and they see my dad's name and they decide. And you walk in and they see your boots and your jacket and they decide. And here we are on a mountain in a blizzard making neither decision on behalf of the other, just, she seemed to run out of words for a second, just being actual people. Novel concept, Ethan said. Radical, she agreed. And there it was again, that thing she had, that wry, precise humor buried under everything else. The humor of someone who learned early on that laughing at the hard things was the only way to carry them without being crushed. Ethan recognized it because he'd been doing the same thing his whole life. He thought not for the first time since he'd found her, but more clearly now that if they'd met at school, if she'd sat 3 rows back and he'd turned around and said that one dumb word he'd almost said that morning, they might have figured this out a lot sooner and with considerably less hypothermia. He filed that thought away. He'd need it later to tell her. He'd tell her that when they got off this mountain. He was going to hold on to that little chip of future like a coal in his fist. When they got off this mountain, he was choosing to believe in that sentence completely. He was choosing to believe it so hard it left no room for the other sentence. The wind shifted, not eased, not calmed, but shifted. And when wind shifts in a storm like this, it's because something's changing, and the change can go either way. Ethan knew this mountain the way you know the face of someone you've driven past your whole life, not by name, not precisely, but by instinct. And instinct told him the storm was not tiring. It was reorganizing. Lily, he said, I need you to move with me toward the root ball. We need more of it between us and the north. She didn't argue. She moved stiffly with the coordination of someone whose body was writing checks. Her muscles couldn't cash, and Ethan supported her the whole way, 3 feet, 4 feet, until they were tucked into the root system of the fallen tree, like 2 animals sharing a burrow. It was tighter here. It was warmer marginally, the dense matrix of roots catching the snow and building its own insulation. Better, she said, testing the word. Better, he confirmed. She leaned her head very carefully against his shoulder. Not a romantic gesture. Nothing that deliberate. Just a body seeking warmth from the one available source, practical as a needle finding north. But Ethan felt it anyway, felt the weight of it, that trust that had nothing to do with knowing someone and everything to do with being the one who showed up. Ethan, yeah. If this, she stopped herself, started again. When my dad gets here, when he agreed firmly, I want you to know that I understand what you did. Her voice was deliberate, careful, like she was choosing the right container for something fragile. Walking off that rope, walking into the woods with nothing. I know what that cost you. I know it isn't. She stopped again. People who grow up the way we grew up don't throw themselves away like that. We learn not to, because nobody else is going to pick up the pieces if we go down. Ethan didn't say anything. So I know it cost you, Lily said, and I need you to know I know that, because I think maybe nobody has ever. She took a breath. I think maybe nobody ever said thank you to your dad either. After, when the emergency was over and the bills started coming, I think people said that was very brave, and then they went home. Her voice was absolutely steady. So I'm saying it now ahead of the going home. Thank you, Ethan Walker. Thank you for being the one who came back. His throat was completely closed. He could not for the life of him speak. So he just nodded. And she understood, and they sat there, and the storm raged, and neither of them was alone. And then Ethan heard something that took him 3 full seconds to process because it was so wrong, so impossible in the middle of all that wind and white. The thing his brain insisted couldn't be there, so it refused to classify the sound until the sound got louder and his body understood before his mind did, and he sat up straight and grabbed her arm. An engine. Not a car engine. Not one engine. Multiple engines, deep and rattling and familiar. The way the sound of something you've heard your whole life is familiar even when you have no rational reason to recognize it. Motorcycles. Lily. He was on his feet before he knew he was moving. Lily, do you hear that? Her head came up. Her eyes went wide, wide open, suddenly completely awake. Is that, she started. Yes, Ethan said. Yeah. He ripped off his glove and shoved his hand into his coat. Her coat's pocket, and his fingers found his flashlight. He had no idea if the battery had held. He had no idea if the bulb had survived the falls. He pointed it up through the gap in the pine boughs and clicked it on, and the beam shot out pale and wavering, and the most beautiful thing he had ever produced in his life. On, off, on, off, on, off. The pattern his grandfather had taught him. Not SOS, too technical, too slow. Just on, off, a rhythm, a heartbeat, here in the middle of nowhere. The engines got louder. They're coming, Lily said, and the way she said it, not whispered, not breathed, said out loud in a real voice with real volume, for the first time in hours, cracked the careful, professional composure Ethan had been maintaining since he'd found her, and he grabbed her hand and held on. Here, he screamed. He screamed it as loud as his body had, standing up and screaming, flashlight, blazing on off through the trees. Over here, we're over here. The engine stuttered, paused. He heard voices, distant, layered under the wind. And then from uphill, a beam of light cut through the dark. Not a flashlight, a headlight, bright and focused, and it swung toward them like a compass, finding north. Ethan grabbed Lily's arm and braced her. Because what came through the trees next was not a rescue team. It was not the state patrol. It was not the ranger service. It was Mason Grayson on his bike off-road, an engine screaming, fishtailing through the underbrush, with the kind of controlled violence that comes from 20 years of riding, and one singular need, and right behind him were 6, 8, 10 more riders spread out through the trees like the fingers of a hand closing all of them, with headlights blazing and all of them calling one name. Not Lily, not his daughter, not any of the careful social words you'd expect. Just one syllable, rough and raw and stripped of everything but the core. Baby girl. And Lily Grayson, who had not cried once in the hours Ethan had known her, who had held herself together through the cold and the dark and the almost not making it, who had sat against a dead tree and talked about hot chocolate and hair braiding and an art school letter she'd kept in her bag for 3 weeks. Lily Grayson heard her father's voice break through the storm, and she came apart. Not in the small, quiet way she'd nearly gone under before. Not in the cold, sliding way the body fails. She came apart the way you do when you've held everything together so long and so hard that the moment someone strong enough to hold it for you shows up, you finally let yourself be a child who is very scared and very relieved and does not have to be brave for one more second. She took one step toward the headlights and her legs didn't hold her. Ethan caught her. He had her arm under her arms and he was holding her up as Mason Grayson swung off his bike and crossed the space between them in 4 steps, and then the man's arms were around his daughter, and it was enormous, that embrace. It was a man who is very large and has never been described as gentle, being utterly perfectly gentle, his daughter's face against his neck, and his eyes squeezed shut and sounds coming out of him that a man like Mason Grayson probably never made in front of other human beings, but was making now without a single thought to spare for what anyone witnessed. I got you, Mason said. His voice was gravel and shaking and certain. Daddy's got you. You're okay. I got you. Ethan stepped back. He hadn't meant to. His legs did it on their own, the instinct of a person who has spent their whole life moving to the edge of spaces out of the center, not taking up room. He stepped back, and the cold hit him from every side now that there was nothing between him and the wind, and he realized for the first time with any real certainty that his hands were bad. He couldn't feel either of them past the wrist, and he couldn't tell if that was the cold, or the fear, or just the moment catching up with him. But he looked down at them, and they were distant from him, in the way a storm looks distant through a window, and he thought with a kind of calm that was definitely a warning sign. That's probably not good. He took one step. The ground came up sideways. He caught himself on the deadfall. One of the Hells Angels was there in an instant, not Mason, one of the others, the one they called Preacher, who turned out to be 6'3" and broad as a door, and who grabbed Ethan's arm with both hands and held him up like it was effortless. Easy, Preacher said. Easy, kid. I got you. Ethan looked at him. How'd you find us? He said and was surprised how thin his voice was. Rope, Preacher said. Tied to the emergency door on the bus. Prewitt finally told us somebody'd gone in on foot. We followed the rope to the bus, then Grizz picked your tracks. Even in this, he found your tracks going off the back. Man can track anything. He tracked you both. Preacher's eyes were doing a quick professional scan of Ethan, and whatever he was seeing was making him move faster. He shrugged off his own jacket leather on the outside, but heavily lined and wrapped it around Ethan before Ethan could object. How long you been without a coat? Don't remember, Ethan said honestly. Can you walk? I walked here. That's not an answer to my question. But Preacher had already shifted his grip, and Ethan understood he wasn't going to be asked to walk very far. Which was good because his legs were conducting their own private vote on the matter, and the results were not in. Across the clearing, Mason Grayson was still holding his daughter, but his eyes had found Ethan over the top of her head, found him and locked on. Ethan met his gaze. He expected he didn't know what he expected. Suspicion, maybe. A man like Mason Grayson had probably spent 20 years watching strangers get near his daughter with the full focus of someone who had never once decided that his child was not worth protecting. Gratitude could come later. First, the eyes would measure. But what was in Mason Grayson's face in that moment was not measurement. It was not suspicion. It was not even the performed gratitude of someone going through social motions. What was in Mason Grayson's face was recognition. One man seeing another and knowing without words what had been paid to be standing in that spot. He held Ethan's gaze for 3 long seconds, and then he bent his head over his daughter's again, and one of his hands reached behind him without looking and pointed at Ethan and said to Preacher, still without looking, "Don't let him go down." "Not planning on it," Preacher said and tightened his grip. Lily had her face in her father's shoulder, and she was saying something muffled into the leather of his vest, and Mason was saying, I know, in that low voice that wasn't trying to be heard by anyone else. And the other riders had made a loose circle, and they were quiet, all of them, quiet, all of these men. The town crossed the street to avoid standing in a circle in the dark in a blizzard, and being nothing other than people who loved someone who almost didn't make it back. Then Lily pulled her face from her father's shoulder and turned, and she found Ethan with her eyes across the distance. "Dad," she said hoarse, "that's Ethan." Mason Grayson turned his full attention to the farm boy. And Ethan Walker, standing with his arms in a borrowed jacket and his body filing very urgent reports that his brain was choosing to defer, met the gaze of the man everyone in town was afraid of. And in Mason Grayson's voice, when he finally spoke, there was only one thing. Not formality, not performance, not debt, just truth the way truth sounds when someone has been stripped down to the bone by fear and relief and is too emptied out for anything else. "Son," Mason Grayson said, "what do I do with you?" Ethan looked at him. "Get us off this mountain," he said. "We can figure out the rest later." And something shifted in Mason Grayson's face, then some tremendous internal thing, some reordering of a world he'd thought he had mapped. And it looked from the outside like the moment a man who has built walls his entire life encounters someone who isn't going to need a door. "Yeah," Mason said. "Yeah, let's do that." He picked his daughter up and carried her to his bike. And Preacher, without any commentary, half carried Ethan Walker out of the trees, and the engines started, and the headlights swung uphill. And somewhere above the storm, for the first time in hours, the clouds shifted, and a piece of sky appeared cold and clear and full of more stars than a person could count, burning over a Montana mountain, where a farm boy had walked off the end of a rope and found something he hadn't gone looking for. It would be 3 more hours before they reached the hospital. Ethan would remember almost none of it, which the doctors later said was consistent with his core temperature readings and was also consistent with not having a coat in a Montana blizzard for the better part of 2 hours. What he would remember in the fragmented and non-chronological way you remember things that happen when your body is closing up shop was Lily's hand finding his in the chaos of moving and engines and noises and squeezing once hard with all the grip she had left, which wasn't much but was everything. And he would remember squeezing back. And he would remember just before everything went gray at the edges and Preacher said something sharp to someone near him, and there were hands on both his arms, a sound coming from somewhere above and behind him. Mason Grayson's voice, not at him, to his men. Quiet, flat, the way a man gives orders when the orders matter. "Find out who this kid is," Mason said. "Find out everything." Ethan Walker woke up not knowing where he was. That lasted about 4 seconds. Then the smell hit him, antiseptic and floor wax, and the particular dry, recycled warmth of a hospital. And his body remembered before his brain did, remembered the cold and the rope. And the moment his legs had filed their resignation somewhere between the trees and the bikes, and he lay very still in the white bed and took a full inventory. Hands. He could feel both of them. That was the first thing. They were wrapped, and they were burning a deep structural burn like the feeling in wood right before it cracks. And the burning was the best possible sign because it meant they were warming up, meant there was still a return trip happening at the cellular level, meant he had not lost anything permanent out there in the dark. He exhaled slowly and something tight in his chest released. Feet. Both feet. Present. Pins and needles bad enough to make him wince, but present. Face. Tight. The kind of tight that meant he'd had frost nip on his cheeks and nose, the kind that would peel and be ugly for a week, and was a souvenir he'd carry for the rest of the winter. He turned his head. His mother was asleep in the chair beside his bed. Susan Walker was 51 years old, and she looked it in a way she never had before his father's accident. Not in a way that was unkind, not aged beyond her years, just fully and honestly. Her years, every one of them, earned and visible. She was still in her diner uniform. The little name tag that said Sue in white letters on black plastic was still pinned to her chest, which meant she'd come from a shift, which meant someone had called the diner, which meant news traveled fast in a small town, even in a blizzard. Her head was tipped back against the wall, and her mouth was slightly open, and one hand was resting palm up in her lap, open like she'd fallen asleep reaching for something. Ethan looked at that hand for a long time. He thought about what Lily had said. I think maybe nobody said thank you to your dad either, after. He thought about his mother coming home from the hospital 4 years ago and sitting in the car and falling apart for exactly 30 seconds, and then wiping her face and going inside. He thought about the jars in the kitchen with the loose change. He thought about the foreclosure date on the letter and the fact that this hospital bed was going to add another number to the bottom of another bill. And there was a part of him, a small, tired, guilty part, that thought maybe he should not have let himself be brought here. Should have said, I'm fine. Should have walked out of those trees on his own 2 feet and saved his family the expense. The thought lasted exactly as long as it took him to understand. It was the thought of a 20-year-old boy who had been told in 100 small and large ways across his entire life that his own survival was a luxury his family couldn't afford. He was going to have to think harder about that later. Right now, his mother was asleep in a chair, and he didn't want to wake her, and his hands hurt enough that he was fairly grateful for whatever was running through the IV in his arm. And the day outside the narrow window was fully arrived, pale gray, winter daylight, which meant he'd been here at least several hours and the storm had either ended or paused for breath. He was trying to remember if there was a window on the north side when the door opened. Not his mother, not a nurse, not anyone he expected. It was Lily. She was in a hospital gown with a blanket over her shoulders and her feet in those grip socks they gave you that had the rubber dots on the bottom, and she had an IV pole that she was pushing in front of her, one-handed, like an unwieldy shopping cart. And she looked terrible in the way that people look terrible after hypothermia, pale except for the high red on her cheekbones, chapped lips, shadows under her eyes dark enough to be bruises. She also looked in Ethan's honest assessment, like someone who had absolutely been told by a nurse to stay in her room and had waited until that nurse's back was turned before doing exactly this. She stopped in the doorway and looked at him. He looked at her. You're awake, she said. Apparently, he said, should you be up? Probably not. She came in anyway, pulling the IV pole around the door and crossed to the chair on the other side of his bed. His mother was on the left, and Lily took the right, which was a very careful piece of positioning that he didn't miss. She sat down slowly like someone whose muscles had submitted a formal complaint and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and looked at him. How are your hands? She said. They hurt. That's good. That's what they tell me. Your feet? Also bad. Also good. Yeah. He shifted in the bed. How are you? She thought about this with what seemed like genuine consideration, not the reflexive fine that people deploy when they don't want to be asked again. I keep thinking about the bus, she said. I keep thinking about being in the back of the bus and everyone leaving and not knowing. She said it flatly without drama in the way people say things they've turned over in their hands for hours. I know nobody meant to. I know it was the panic and the storm. But I keep thinking, she stopped. I keep thinking that I wasn't even surprised. That's the part that gets me. When I woke up and the bus was empty, I wasn't surprised. I thought, of course. And I hate that I thought that. The room was quiet for a moment. Tell me you know it wasn't your fault, Ethan said. I know it cognitively, Lily said. That's not what I asked. She met his eyes, held them. I'm working on it, she said, which was a more honest answer than most people had the courage to give, and Ethan respected it completely. Me too, he said. She looked at his wrapped hands and then back at his face. My dad wants to see you, she said. When you're up to it. He's been outside this room twice already. Nurse keeps redirecting him to the waiting room. I imagine that's working great, Ethan said. Something warmed in her expression. She's a very determined woman, she said. And he's been surprisingly cooperative, actually. Hey, Mama. He's scared. She said that last word like she was explaining something about the structure of an atom precisely without sentimentality. When my dad's scared, he gets very quiet and very agreeable, and you need to know that about him because people think the scary version of him is the big loud one, but it's not. It's the quiet one. The quiet one is the one that means something real is happening. Ethan thought about what that said about Mason Grayson. Yes, but also about Lily, who had read her father that carefully and that completely, who knew the frequency of his fear because she'd been the one watching his face for 20 years. What did he say, Ethan asked, when you told him about what happened out there? Lily was quiet for a long moment. Her hands were wrapped too, he noticed, though less extensively than his. I didn't tell him everything yet, she said. I told him the outline. She stopped. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, and he kept his face very still in a way that meant he was doing a lot of work to keep it still. And when I got to the part where I said, you walked off the end of the rope into the woods, he made a sound. She paused. I don't know how to describe the sound exactly. It wasn't a word. It wasn't really even something he meant to make. It just came out of him. What kind of sound? Ethan asked. Lily looked at him. The kind that means something mattered to him so much that he ran out of the tools he normally uses to deal with things mattering to him. She paused. My dad doesn't do that. I've seen him at funerals. I've seen him in waiting rooms. I've never once seen him run out of tools. She held his gaze. You should know that, about the kind of thing you did. Ethan didn't look away. I want you to understand something, Lily said. My father is going to come into this room and he's going to try to do something for your family. He's going to find out about the farm and the bills and the bank letter, and he's going to want to fix it. Not because he thinks he can buy what you did, he knows he can't, but because he has a need in him when someone does something true to answer it with something true and money or help or whatever it is to him that's not charity. It's a response. She leaned forward slightly. I'm telling you this because I don't want you to refuse. I don't want you to do the thing where you say no because you're proud and you've spent your whole life not asking for anything. Because you earned a yes. You earned it with frostbite and a flashlight and my dad's borrowed rope, and you are allowed to say yes. Ethan's jaw was tight. Lily, I mean it, she said. You told me out there on the mountain that you knew what it felt like to be the one everyone leaves behind. That's not going to happen tonight. Not on my watch, and definitely not on my father's. The door shifted behind her. Susan Walker had woken up. She sat upright in the chair with the fast-calibrated alertness of a woman who had been sleeping lightly for months, the way you sleep when something at home needs monitoring. And her eyes went to her son, first instant, complete the scan of a mother who has been the only one watching. And then to Lily, and Ethan watched his mother assemble the situation quickly, taking in the hospital gown, and the IV pole and the blanket, and the position of the girl across from her son's bed. You must be Lily, Susan Walker said. And her voice was exactly what Ethan's voice had always been, quiet and direct and without performance. Mrs. Walker, Lily said. Sue. Susan said it like a small correction. How are you feeling, honey? Better than I should be, Lily said. Your son is very good at giving instructions. Susan Walker looked at her son for a long time. Ethan endured it. There was something happening in his mother's face that he had no prior reference for. Not quite pride, not quite relief, something more complicated, something that lived in the space between being terrified for someone and recognizing them fully. He gets it from his grandfather, Susan Walker said finally, and her voice was completely steady, and Ethan knew it cost her something to make it so. I'd like to meet him, Lily said. He died 4 years ago, Ethan said. I know, Lily said. I'd still like to meet him somehow. You talk about him like he's still in the room. Susan Walker made a sound that might have been a laugh, short and surprised and genuine. Doesn't he, she said, and looked at her son with something that Ethan was going to need to look at from the side for a while before he could call it by its name. The door opened again, and this time it was not someone creeping in quietly. Mason Grayson did not do anything quietly. He arrived in a doorway the way a weather system arrives, not because he was loud, but because he took up a specific amount of space and made no apologies for it. He was still in his riding clothes, leather vest over flannel, and he'd been in this hospital for however many hours without sleeping, which was visible in his face around his eyes. He stopped when he saw Lily, and something in his expression both tightened and released at once. The simultaneous relief and renewed fear that comes from seeing someone you love and being reminded they were almost not there to see. They told you to stay in your room, he said to his daughter. They made a suggestion, Lily said. I considered it. Lily, Shum? Dad. She said his name simply without negotiation, the one word doing the work of an entire argument. And Mason Grayson, whom the town crossed the street to avoid, closed his mouth. He turned to Ethan. And here is the thing about Mason Grayson, that nobody who hadn't seen him in that moment would ever believe he didn't know what to do with his hands. This enormous man, this legend of a figure who commanded rooms without trying, stood at the foot of a hospital bed, and did not know where to put his hands. And that uncertainty was the most human thing Ethan Walker had ever seen. He settled them on the footboard of the bed, gripped it. Your hands, he said, looking at Ethan's wrappings. They're going to be fine, Ethan said. You sure? Doctor seems to think so. I want to talk to the doctor myself. Mason, Lily said from the other chair. He just told you they're fine. I heard him, Mason said. I want to hear it from the doctor. A small beat, then Ethan said, That's fair. Mason Grayson looked at him with an expression that was very difficult to read and very easy to feel. Lily told me some of what happened, he said. Out there, his voice was doing the controlled thing, the careful, measured thing, but underneath it was the texture of something that hadn't been processed yet, something big and raw that was waiting for a private moment to finish existing. She told me about the rope and the bus. Yeah. You walked off the rope. Yeah. Mason gripped the footboard a little tighter. Son, he said, and the word landed differently than it had on the mountain landed, with more weight, more intention. Do you understand what you did? I found her, Ethan said simply. You walked into a Montana blizzard at night in a storm with no rope and no coat after already being out in it for... Mason stopped. His jaw worked. Preacher said your core temp was in a place that... He stopped again, started over differently. You could have died out there. I know. But you went anyway. I know. Why? And here it was, the question he'd been carrying since the mountain, since Preacher had said, look at this kid, Grizz, just look at him, and Mason had looked, and what he'd seen had rearranged something in him he hadn't known needed rearranging. Ethan glanced at Lily. She gave him the smallest nod. Because she went out at the back of the bus looking for us, Ethan said. Because she woke up alone on a wrecked bus in a blizzard, and nobody came, and she didn't sit down and wait because she'd never in her life had a reason to believe anyone was coming. And I couldn't, he stopped. I couldn't let that be the last experience she had of people, of what people do for each other. He met Mason's eyes. She deserved better than that. Somebody had to show up and be the thing she'd stopped expecting. The room was absolutely silent. Susan Walker was looking at her son with those eyes he couldn't look at directly yet. Mason Grayson's hands released the footboard. He pulled a chair from against the wall, just picked it up, moved it to the side of Ethan's bed, sat down in it with the deliberate care of a large man who has learned to move carefully around breakable things, and he sat down and he leaned forward with his forearms on his knees, and he looked at Ethan Walker the way you look at something you want to fully understand. Tell me about the farm, Mason said. Ethan blinked. Of all the things he'd expected. What? Your family's farm. Tell me about it. That's not... Ethan started and then stopped because Lily was looking at him from the other chair with an expression that said, what did I tell you? And his mother was very carefully looking at the window, and he understood, with the feeling of a door opening, that this was not a conversation he was going to be able to redirect. My grandfather built the barn, Ethan said. 3 summers, by himself. What else? It's 140 acres. We run cattle, mostly some hay. Or we did before my dad's injury. He kept his voice level. We've had the land since my grandfather bought it. Nobody in my family has ever sold an acre of it. Mason nodded. Your dad, what happened? Ethan's eyes moved to his mother without meaning to. She turned from the window and met his gaze and did the small thing, the quarter-inch nod, the imperceptible permission that she did when she was telling him he didn't need to protect her from anything. He told Mason about his father, about the neighbor's boy lost in a storm 4 years back, about his father going in after him the same way Ethan had gone in after Lily, about the fall, the hip, the leg broken in 4 places, the surgery, the months of recovery that turned into permanent limitation, the farm that had hemorrhaged money while a strong man lay on his back watching it go. He told it without self-pity because he'd never had much use for self-pity, but he told it completely. When he finished, Mason sat with her for a moment. Your father went in after a neighbor's kid, Mason said. Yes, sir. In the family. Afterwards, did they come? They were grateful, Ethan said. They were very grateful. The way he said it carried everything that wasn't said grateful. And then they went home, and then the bills came, and then my father became a burden in a town that is very good at forgetting what it owes people. Mason Grayson heard all of it. I want to see the farm, Mason said. It's not... Ethan stopped. With respect, Mr. Grayson, I'm not looking for... I know you're not, Mason said. That's not why I'm asking. He leaned back into the chair. I run a mechanic shop, commercial heavy equipment mostly. I've got 12 guys on payroll and equipment worth... He paused, working out the number. More than your family's land debt, probably. I don't say that to impress you. I say it because I want you to understand what I'm offering is not charity. He said the word like he knew it would stick in Ethan's craw, and he was preempting it. I'm not offering charity, I'm offering work. Real work. Equipment repair, maintenance, contracts, seasonal stuff. For a farm that's about to go under because a good man got broken saving someone else's kid, and the world didn't cover the cost. His jaw set. That's a wrong I can make less wrong, so I'd like to see the farm. The silence held for a beat. Ethan's mother said very quietly, you'd want to see it. I'd like to, Mason said, turning to her with the formal courtesy that Ethan had not anticipated from him and probably should have, because a man who teaches himself to braid his daughter's hair is paying attention in ways that most people don't. If that's all right with you, ma'am. Susan Walker considered Mason Grayson across the hospital room with the calm and careful scrutiny of a woman who has been making large decisions alone for 4 years and is very good at reading the actual content behind what people present to her. Ethan's grandfather, she said, carved our name into the beam in the back of the barn when he built it. Yes, ma'am, Ethan told me. I'd hate for that beam to end up in a landfill, Susan Walker said. It was the most precise and complete thing she could have said, and it meant yes, and it meant I understand what you're offering, and it meant thank you in the only language she had for accepting something she hadn't been able to provide herself. Mason nodded once, so much. It won't, he said, not a promise, a fact. And then the door opened again, and this time it was several things at once. The nurse who had apparently been looking for Lily for 20 minutes, moving with the brisk, purposeful energy of a woman whose professional patience had reached its endpoint. Behind her preacher who was eating a hospital cafeteria sandwich with the expression of a man who was also running on no sleep and considerable adrenaline and had decided that hunger was fixable and nothing else currently was. And behind preacher someone Ethan had not expected at all. Dale Pruitt. The woodshop teacher and JV coach was still in his storm gear, and he looked, there was no other way to say this, like a man who had spent the last several hours sitting very still with his own choices. He was pale. He was carrying his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim, and he stopped when he saw Ethan, and he stopped when he saw Mason Grayson. And the particular quality of his stopping when he saw Mason was the stop of someone who has run a scenario in their head and is now facing the live version. Mason Grayson looked at him. Pruitt looked at Mason Grayson. The room contracted around that moment. Mr. Grayson, Pruitt said. His voice came out smaller than it had on the mountain. Mason said nothing. I want to, Pruitt started, and then corrected himself because he was clearly trying to be honest, and honesty required precision. I need to tell you that I failed in my responsibility. Both of them. Your daughter shouldn't have been left on that bus, and Ethan shouldn't have had to. He gestured vaguely at the hospital bed, at the wrapped hands, at the whole enormous situation. He shouldn't have been the one who had to go in. I was the adult. I was the one who was supposed to. He stopped. His jaw was working the same way Mason's had worked when he'd been trying to contain something. I failed them. Both of them. And I understand if you want to. He ran out of sentence. Everybody in the room understood what the end of that sentence was going to be. What Mason Grayson did next was not what any of them expected. He let the silence sit for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "You came here." Prewitt blinked. "What?" "Tonight, you came here." Mason's voice was not warm, but it was also not what it had been at the beginning of that silence, which had been the silence of a man deciding something. "You didn't have to do that." Prewitt seemed genuinely uncertain what to do with this. "No, I know, but You came here?" "Here," Mason said again. "That matters. A beat. Not as much as what happened on the mountain, but it matters." He looked at the man steadily. "I'm not going to do anything to you, Prewitt. I want you to understand that. Not because I'm not angry. I'm angry enough that I've been sitting in this waiting room for 6 hours specifically. So I didn't say anything to anyone while I was still this angry. But because my daughter is alive, and the reason she's alive is in that bed. And I'm not going to give Ethan's night a worse ending than it's already had by making it about me." He paused. "But I need you to carry what happened, not legally, just personally. You carry it. That's all I'm asking." Prewitt looked like a man who had expected either violence or dismissal, and had received neither, and found the third option considerably harder than either of the first two would have been. "I'll carry it," he said. His voice had nothing in it that was defensive. Mason nodded once. "Done. Filed." He turned back to Ethan as though Prewitt had become a resolved equation. "The nurse is going to make Lily go back to her room now," he said. "I'm right here," Lily said. "I know," Mason said, and turned to his daughter with a look that contained every hour he'd spent on that mountain and in that waiting room and in that particular chair by the phone where he'd received the call, all of it compressed into the simple, terrifying relief of looking at the person you would do anything for and finding them present. "Go back to your room. Sleep. I'll come see you in an hour." "Dad." Lily. The same one-word conversation she'd deployed on him 30 minutes ago returned. She pressed her lips together. Then she stood slowly and pulled the blanket tighter, and she looked at Ethan, and what passed between them in that look had no language, for it had the shorthand of people who have been through something together that other people haven't been through, the compressed communication of shared extremity. "Sleep," she said to him. "You too," he said. She left. The nurse followed with a relieved expression. Preacher finished his sandwich. He pulled a chair to the corner, settled into it, crossed his ankles, and closed his eyes, and Ethan understood that Preacher was not leaving, was going to be in that corner until further notice, which was simultaneously strange and oddly comforting. Susan Walker stood and came to the side of her son's bed, and she did something she hadn't done in 4 years in front of another human being. She put her hand on the side of his face very gently, the way you touch something you almost lost, and she looked at him for a long moment. "I need to ask you something," she said quietly. "Okay." "Did you know," she paused, started again. "When you went in, did you know you might not come back?" Ethan thought about the moment on the bus, the end of the rope, the open back door, and the tracks going off into the dark. He thought about the exact weight of the decision, the precise understanding he'd had of what he was doing. "Yeah," he said, "and you went anyway." "Yeah," his mother nodded. Her hand was very steady. Her eyes were the only thing that wasn't. "Your grandfather," she said, "would have done the same thing." "I know," Ethan said. "I know he would have. That's why I went." Susan Walker made a sound, then small, private, contained, and she bent and put her forehead against her son's forehead for exactly 4 seconds, the way she had when he was a child, and she was checking if he was all right, and then she straightened up and her face was completely composed, and she sat back down in her chair, and that was the most of that they would ever say out loud, and it was exactly enough. Mason Grayson watched this and said nothing and asked nothing. He pulled out his phone and looked at the screen and said, "My shop opens at 7. I want to drive out and see the Walker place before then." He glanced at Susan. "If that suits you." "It suits us," Susan Walker said before Ethan could calculate a response. Mason put his phone down. "The bank letter," he said. "Can I see it?" This time Ethan didn't hesitate. "It's on the kitchen table," he said. "I figured." Mason leaned back in his chair. He looked suddenly in this moment exhausted, not depleted, not broken, but the honest exhaustion of a man who has run very hard and very far on nothing but adrenaline and love, and is now in the first safe moment available to him, allowing himself to feel the weight of the miles. "Tell me about the barn," he said, not because he needed to know, because he understood that talking about the barn was the thing Ethan Walker needed most in this moment, and Mason Grayson had been paying exactly that kind of attention since he walked through the door. Ethan looked at this man, this enormous, leather-vested, tattooed, terrifying figure who had ridden through a blizzard on a motorcycle to find his daughter and then sat in a waiting room for 6 hours managing his own anger so it wouldn't ruin someone else's night. And he felt something he had not expected to feel. He felt safe. It wasn't a complicated feeling. It wasn't dressed up. It was just the plain animal experience of safety, of being in a room where someone more capable of handling the external threats had taken on the job of handling them. And Ethan had not felt that since before his father's accident, had not felt it since the last time Tom Walker had been the kind of whole and present that let a son stop worrying about the outside world. "The barn faces east," Ethan said, "so the first light of the day always hits the front of it. My grandfather said he did that on purpose. Said he wanted to start every day watching the sun come up on something he'd built." Mason Grayson listened. Preacher in the corner with his eyes closed was also listening. Susan Walker was looking at her hands, but her shoulders had dropped just slightly from the position they'd been in since she'd walked through the door. That particular set of the shoulders that means a person has been bracing for something and has just for the first time in hours been given permission to stop. "He sounds like a man who knew what he was doing," Mason said. "He knew exactly what he was doing," Ethan said. "And he taught me everything he could before he was gone, and I hope it was enough because it's all I had out there tonight." He looked at his wrapped hands. "Turns out it was." "Turns out it was," Mason agreed. And then from down the hall, very faintly, faintly enough that it might have been imagination, there was the sound of a door, and then Preacher opened one eye and said, "She's back in her room," without anyone asking him how he knew, and Mason Grayson looked at the ceiling and exhaled one long breath and closed his eyes. They sat like that for a while, a farm boy, his mother, a Hells Angels leader, and a man named Preacher eating a second sandwich in the corner in the flat white light of a hospital room in the early morning of a Montana winter. Each of them carrying the weight of a night that had gone, a direction it shouldn't have, and arrived somewhere none of them had expected, somewhere that felt against all reasonable expectation like the beginning of something. The storm had stopped. Ethan didn't know when. Somewhere in the stretch of conversation and eye of fluid, in the specific mercy of a room where nothing was required of him. For the first time in memory, the roaring had stopped and the world outside the window had gone to that particular dead silence of new snow. The silence that feels clean, that feels like the world wiped its own slate, that feels like an invitation to start something over. He was almost asleep when Mason's voice came from the chair, quiet and not directed at anyone. "My guys found the rope," he said, "the one tied to the emergency door." Ethan opened his eyes. "They brought it back," Mason said, "the orange one from the ranger station." A pause. "Preacher's got it." Ethan looked at Preacher, who opened one eye, looked back, and patted the pack at his feet. "Why, hi, Ethan said. Mason considered. "Because sometimes," he said, "the thing that saves somebody is worth keeping." Ethan stared at the ceiling. "Okay," he said. "Get some sleep," Mason said. And for the first time since he could remember, Ethan Walker closed his eyes in a room where someone else was watching the door, and he let himself sleep, and it was the deepest sleep he'd had in 4 years, and he didn't dream about the storm at all. He dreamed about a barn facing east, and the first light coming up gold on everything his grandfather had built, and his name carved into the beam in the corner, and the word Walkers in the old man's handwriting, and how it looked permanent, how it looked like something that was going to be there a long time, how it looked like it wasn't going anywhere. Part 4. The bank letter was still on the kitchen table when they got home. Ethan had been discharged 2 days after the storm, hands wrapped, face peeling, walking under his own power, which the doctor had called remarkable, and which Ethan called necessary because there was no one else to do the walking. His mother had driven him home in the truck that needed new brake pads and made a sound on left turns that neither of them mentioned because mentioning it meant dealing with it, and dealing with it meant money. The roads were clear now. The storm had left everything white and still, and the kind of clean that felt dishonest, like the world had dressed up for an occasion it hadn't earned. Susan Walker had not told her husband everything yet. Tom Walker knew his son had been in the hospital. Tom Walker knew there had been an accident on the mountain trip. What Tom Walker did not fully know, because Susan had parceled out the information in the careful doses of a woman who understood exactly how much her husband could carry, and when was the rope in the bus, in the wall, walking off the end of things into the dark. She'd given him the outline. She'd said Ethan had helped someone. She'd said he was fine. She'd managed the information the way she managed everything, with precision and love, and the particular skill of someone who has learned that the full truth delivered all at once is sometimes just cruelty wearing the costume of honesty. But Tom Walker was sitting in his chair when they came through the door, and he looked at his son's wrapped hands, and his face did something that no dose management could prevent. "Come here," Tom said. His voice was quiet. It was the voice of a man who had spent 4 years watching his son carry what should have been his to carry, and who had developed in that time a very accurate internal instrument for measuring when something significant had happened to that son. Ethan crossed the room and sat on the edge of the coffee table, close enough that his father could reach him, which was what his father needed. The physical confirmation, the ability to put a hand on his son's arm and feel him solid and present. Tom Walker's hand on Ethan's arm was slightly unsteady, with the damage the fall had left in his nerves, and it gripped anyway, and it was warm, and it was certain, and Ethan had to look at the floor for a second. "Tell me," Tom said. "Mom told you." "Tell me yourself," Tom said. "The whole thing." So Ethan told him. He told his father the whole thing, the rope, and the bus, and the back door standing open, and the tracks going off into the woods, and the decision at the end of the rope. He watched his father's face while he talked. Tom Walker's face was 54 years old and had a quality of landscape to it now, the way faces do when they've been through enough weather to keep the evidence lines around the eyes. A set to the jaw that hadn't been there before the accident, and while his son talked, every part of that landscape was completely still, except his eyes, which were doing something they hadn't done in the 4 years Ethan had been watching them. They were filling. Tom Walker did not cry. Ethan had never once seen his father cry, not at the hospital, not in the long months of recovery, not when the first bank letter arrived. What Tom Walker's eyes did was fill to a precise line and hold their full and unspilled the way water holds at the edge of a container that is exactly the right size for what's in it. "You tied the rope to the door," Tom said, "so they'd know which direction. And then you went." "Yeah, with no coat. I'd given it to her." Tom Walker was quiet for a very long moment. "You did it the right way," he said. "Better than I did. You left a marker. I didn't leave a marker." He said it without bitterness, just the honest audit of a man applying his experience to his sons, finding the differences, calling them out. "I just went in. Didn't think about what happened after. Didn't think about how they'd know where to find me. You thought about it. You did it smarter." Ethan hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected his father to find in the story of what could have been a tragedy the specific technical improvement his son had made on his own near-tragic method, and hold it up not as a defense or an excuse, but as genuine recognition. "I learned from you," Ethan said. "You learned past me," Tom said. "That's what you're supposed to do." They sat with that. "This man," Tom said, "Grayson, he wants to see the farm," Ethan said. "He's coming today." Tom nodded slowly. He looked at his own hands resting in his lap, the right one still slightly curled from the nerve damage, and then he looked at his son's wrapped ones. Something in his expression had the texture of a man settling accounts, not dramatically, not with grand language, but the quiet arithmetic of a person tallying what was owed and to whom. "I should have been the one to go get you off that mountain," Tom said. "Dad, let me finish." His voice was steady. "I should have been the one. I know I couldn't. I know that. But a father's supposed to be able to go into the bad thing for his kid, and I couldn't, and you've been compensating for that for 4 years, and I know it, Ethan. I know it every day." He met his son's eyes. "I'm not saying this for me. I'm saying it because you need to hear that I see it, that I'm not somewhere else thinking about other things. I see what you do. I see what it costs you. And I see what you did on that mountain, and I am—" His voice did the thing at the edge of controlled, caught itself held. "I am so proud of you. I have always been so proud of you. But tonight it is a different quality of proud than I have ever had before, and I needed you to know that." Ethan's jaw was tight enough to ache. "Don't make me cry in front of you," he said. "Then we're even," his father said, with the ghost of something that had once been a very easy smile and was now harder won and therefore worth considerably more. The truck came up the drive at 10:15. Ethan knew the sound of it before he could see it, which was interesting because he'd never heard Mason Grayson's truck before, and yet there was something about the way it moved purposefully, not slow but not showing off, that he recognized. Susan Walker went to the window and came back and said with a studied neutrality, "There are several of them. There were in fact 6. Mason Grayson came in a truck. Preacher came in a truck behind him. 4 other riders came in various vehicles, and they all parked in the drive with the orderliness of people who have spent a lot of time moving in groups and have developed, without discussing it, an instinct for formation. They got out and stood in the cold in their vests, in their flannel, and their particular brand of self-possession, and from the front window of the farmhouse, Ethan watched his father look at them. "Huh," Tom Walker said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "Your mother's going to make coffee. She already started." "That's your mother," Tom said, and there was 25 years of marriage compressed into those 3 words. Mason Grayson knocked on the front door, and Ethan answered it, hands still wrapped, and Mason looked at the wrappings and said, "How are they today?" "Better," Ethan said. "Come in." What happened in the next 20 minutes was something Ethan would spend a long time trying to describe to himself afterward because it didn't have the shape he'd expected. He'd expected, without fully forming the expectation, a transaction, a meeting with defined roles. The man who was owed something and the man offering something in return, and the negotiation of the space between those positions. What happened instead was something more ordinary and more complicated than that. Mason Grayson sat at the kitchen table across from Tom Walker, and Tom Walker looked at Mason Grayson with the clear eyes of a man who had run out of the energy required for pretending things were other than they were, and Mason looked back with the same economy, and they talked. Not about the farm right away, about the accident. Tom's accident 4 years back, the neighbor's boy, the storm. Mason had been told the outline and he wanted more, and Tom Walker told him more, and Ethan watched his father talk about it to a stranger in a way he had never talked about it in front of his son, with a specificity and an emotional honesty that was possible, Ethan realized, precisely because Mason Grayson was a stranger. You could say certain things to someone who had no prior image of you to protect. "You didn't hesitate," Mason said when Tom got to the part about going in. "Never even occurred to me," Tom said. "Kid was out there. What else were you going to do?" "Yeah," Mason said. "What else were you going to do?" Tom said again, not rhetorically, genuinely, as though the question still sometimes surprised him when he turned it over. "Nothing else," Mason said. "There's nothing else you can do. That's not bravery. That's just being built a certain way." Tom Walker looked at Mason Grayson with an expression that was part recognition and part something older and more tired and more relieved than recognition. "Nobody ever said that to me," he said. "They said I was brave. They said it was admirable. They sent a casserole." The last words landed dry, not bitter, but precise. "Nobody said it was just being built a certain way." "Well," Mason said, "it is." He wrapped his hands around the coffee mug Susan had put in front of him. "I've got guys in my chapter who'd ride into a burning building for someone they love. They're not heroes. They're just built to go toward the fire instead of away from it." A pause. "Your son is built the same way." Tom Walker looked at his son across the kitchen. Ethan looked back. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. It was Preacher who asked about the bank letter. He did it the way Preacher apparently did most things, directly, without preamble, as though the social dance of approaching a difficult subject from the side was an inefficiency he'd long since eliminated. He picked the letter up from the table. It had been sitting there through the whole conversation, present and unaddressed, the elephant so large it had become furniture. And he looked at the number on it, and his expression did not change. "This the foreclosure amount," he said. Tom Walker's jaw tightened. "Yes." "And the date?" 3 weeks. Preacher put the letter back down. He looked at Mason. Something passed between them, not a conversation, not even a signal. Just the communication of 2 people who have known each other long enough that certain understandings don't require language. Mason looked at Tom Walker. "I run a heavy equipment repair operation," he said. "You've got a farm. Farms have equipment. I'm guessing yours needs work. Everything needs work, Tom said with a kind of flat honesty that was almost humor. I'd like to look at it, Mason said. If you're willing. Tom was quiet for a moment. Ethan could see him working through it, the pride and the need and the calculation of what it meant to say yes. And he knew his father well enough to know that what Tom was running through wasn't, do I deserve this, but is this real? Because Tom Walker had been in a position where he was vulnerable for long enough that he developed a finely tuned instrument for detecting when something offered was not actually what it appeared to be. Why, Tom said, not suspiciously, just directly. Because your son walked into a blizzard with nothing and brought my daughter back, Mason said with equal directness. And I've been into the business of understanding what things are worth long enough to know that what he did is worth more than I can pay. So I'm not trying to pay it, I'm trying to answer it. He paused. There's a difference. Tom Walker looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, the tractor's been making a sound. Let me hear it, Mason said. They went out to the barn. All six of them, Mason, a preacher, and the four others, and Tom Walker on the cane he hated, and Ethan with his wrapped hands, all of them in the cold morning, walking out to the barn. And when Tom pushed open the barn door and the light fell in, Ethan watched Mason Grayson take in the space the way certain people take in a space that has been made with intention. Not admiring it out loud, just receiving it. The high beams, the organization, the evidence of a family that had worked this place for decades and worked it seriously. Preacher went straight to the tractor like a man walking to an old argument he already knows how to win. One of the others, a quiet man everyone called Dutch, was already looking at the hydraulic system with the focused expression of someone who sees problems in mechanical things the way some people see shapes in clouds. He was shaking his head, but it was the head shake of a man who knows exactly what's wrong and knows exactly how to fix it, which is an entirely different head shake from the one that means this is beyond saving. Dutch, Mason said. Give me an hour, Dutch said, already moving. You need parts. Dutch listed them without looking up from memory the way you list things you've been mentally cataloging for years. Preacher wrote them on his phone. Two of the other men went back to their trucks for tools. Tom Walker stood in the door of his own barn and watched these men move through it, and his face was something Ethan would remember for the rest of his life because it had in it every feeling a man can have, at once gratitude and pride, and the specific ache of being helped when you've spent years beyond the point where pride made that possible, the ache of accepting something real from people you'd never expected to receive anything from. The ache of your son standing next to you with wrapped hands because he went further than a man should have to go, because the ordinary systems failed and strangers on motorcycles were the thing that came to meet the extraordinary. Your grandfather built this, Mason said, not a question, running his hand along the main post at the front. 3 summers, Tom said. Wouldn't let anybody help. I thought he was crazy when I was young. Thought it was ego. He paused. Now I think he just wanted to know it was his, all the way through. Mason nodded. He walked the length of the barn slowly, hands in pockets, looking up at the beams. He stopped at the back corner. He looked at the beam there for a moment. Then he said, where? Tom Walker pointed, halfway up on the inner face. Mason pulled out his phone and used the flashlight. Walker's. He stood there for a moment looking at it. Then he said, that's not going anywhere. That's what I told Ethan, Susan Walker said from behind them. She had followed them out with the coffee pot, and nobody had heard her come in because Susan Walker moved through her own home silently and completely, a habit born of years of managing a household around a man's pain without wanting the man to hear her managing it. Mason turned and accepted the refill without making a production of it, which was, Ethan thought, the right response. You've run this place yourself, Mason said to her. We've run it, Susan said. She nodded at Tom. I've watched her run it, Tom said with a candor that was the gift of a man who has had 4 years to lose his vanity about such things. She won't say that, but it's true. I know the difference, Susan said, quiet and firm, between doing something alone and doing something with someone who can't stand up beside you but is standing with you anyway. Mason Grayson looked at her for a moment. Yes, ma'am, he said. I know that difference too. And he did. Ethan understood, looking at Mason in that moment, that this man had raised a daughter alone, had been the whole shape of a family for a long time, had done it in the way Susan Walker had done it, with the person they loved beside them, in the ways that were available, even when those ways were not the ways either of them had planned. The morning moved. Dutch had the tractor running by noon. It was not a small thing, whatever sound it had been making it for a reason. And the reason was a cascade of deferred maintenance that had been deferred because money had been deferred, and Dutch and Preacher between them worked through it with the efficiency of people who have been fixing things their whole lives and understand that a thing fixed correctly now is a thing that doesn't fail you at the worst moment later. Tom Walker sat on a hay bale and watched. Ethan sat next to him. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. There was something happening in the barn that was beyond conversation. Something that had the quality of watching a tide turn slow and enormous and too large to comment on in real time. It was around 2 in the afternoon when the tractor was running clean and Dutch was packing his tools, and Preacher was explaining to Tom in more detail than Tom had probably asked for exactly what had been wrong with the hydraulic coupling that Mason came to where Ethan was standing and said, "Walk with me a minute." They went out the barn door and stood in the cold, just the two of them, the field stretching out white and quiet and enormous on every side, and Mason stood with his hands in his pockets looking at the land, and Ethan stood next to him and waited. "My daughter told me something this morning," Mason said. Ethan waited. "She told me about the art school." He let that sit for a second. "The letter she kept in her bag for 3 weeks." Ethan was very still. "She told me at the hospital while you were still out," Mason said. "She woke up and I was there and she looked at me and she said, 'Dad, I need to tell you something,' and she told me about the letter." He paused. 2 years ago. "She was protecting you," Ethan said carefully. "I know that," Mason said, and his voice had something in it that was very heavy and very honest. "I know that's what she was doing, and I have been," he stopped, restarted. "I've been sitting with the fact that my daughter made herself smaller for 2 years so I wouldn't be lonely, and I didn't know, and that is on me. That is entirely on me, because I raised her to take care of people, and I didn't raise her enough to let people take care of her." He was looking at the fields. "Sound familiar?" Ethan didn't say anything. "I'm not asking her to leave," Mason said. "She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go. But I'm going to make sure she knows the door's open, that if she wants it, the option is still possible." He turned to look at Ethan. "She told me you talked on the mountain about who you might have been in other versions of things." "Yeah, I think she needed someone to say that out loud," Mason said, "that it was a real question, that she was allowed to ask it." He held Ethan's gaze. "Thank you for that too. Not just for bringing her home, for talking to her like she was someone whose inner life mattered." Ethan felt the words land somewhere he hadn't expected them to land. "She's easy to talk to," he said, which was true and also inadequate, but was the most honest thing available to him. Mason looked at him for a moment longer with that expression that Ethan had come to understand was Mason's version of reading very carefully. Then he said, "The bank letter. Mr. Grayson, Mason, Ethan stopped. "I can't let you." "You can," Mason said, "and you're going to. Not because you don't have pride, you've got more than is probably good for you, which I say as a man who has the same problem, but because there's a difference between asking and receiving, and you didn't ask." He held Ethan's gaze, and his voice had the absolute certainty of a man who has worked out the ethics of a situation completely and is not interested in revisiting them. "You didn't ask me for a thing. You walked into a blizzard for my daughter because it was the right thing to do, and you didn't leave a bill. So what I'm doing right now is not charity, and it is not payment. It is one man recognizing another man's family deserves to keep their land." A beat. "You let me answer what you did, Ethan. That's all I'm asking. You let me answer it." Ethan looked at the fields, his grandfather's fields. 140 acres his family had not sold a single piece of in 3 generations. The foreclosure date printed on a letter in a font that didn't care. "Okay," he said. "It came out rough." "Okay," Mason said. They stood in the cold for another moment. "There's something else," Mason said. Ethan waited. "My shop," Mason said. "I'm going to need someone to help run the front office side, scheduling customer contact, managing the books. My current guy is retiring in the spring." He glanced sideways at Ethan. "It's not farm work. It's not football. It's regular hours and real pay, and it's work that matters. And before you say anything about charity again, I want you to understand that I am going to need that job filled. And the first person I thought of was someone who knows how to stay calm when everything is on fire, because that's what that job actually is." Ethan was quiet. You don't have to answer now, Mason said. Can I ask one thing? Ethan said. Yeah. Would you have thought of me if I hadn't been the one to find her? Mason was quiet for a moment. Then, because he was a man who gave honest answers, even when the social version was available. Probably not. Probably never would have known your name. He paused. But that's not what I'm hiring. I'm not hiring the person who went in. I'm hiring the person who tied the rope to the door before he went in. The person who thought about how to leave a trail, even when they were terrified. That's a different thing than bravery. That's judgment. And judgment is the thing I can't train. Ethan looked at him. That's either the best pitch for a job I've ever heard, Ethan said, or you're very good at this. Both, Mason said without hesitation, and for the first time Ethan heard something in his voice that lived in the same neighborhood as humor, that same dry buried register he'd recognized in Lily, and he understood where she got it from. I'll think about it, Ethan said. Fair, Mason said. They went back inside. What happened over the next 3 hours was something Ethan had no category for, because it was not the kind of event he'd been taught to expect from life. His father and Mason Grayson sat at the kitchen table and talked about equipment and land management and the particular economics of small ranching operations in a way that told Ethan, listening from across the room, that Mason knew considerably more about that world than his appearance suggested. Tom Walker, who had been managing his own social interactions with the careful, limited energy of someone who knows they have a finite supply, was not managing with Mason. He was just talking. The way you talk to someone when you're not performing anything. Susan Walker made lunch, and when Mason stood to help her clear plates, she led him without protest, which Ethan clocked as a significant data point, because his mother did not let strangers help her in her own kitchen as a rule. Preacher fell asleep on the couch. Nobody woke him. Dutch and the others had gone back to their trucks at some point and returned with 2 more things that needed fixing that Dutch had apparently identified on his first pass and filed away. And the sound of work being done on the Walker property had a quality to it that afternoon that it hadn't had in 4 years, a kind of purposeful noise, the noise of people who knew what they were doing it together. At 4 o'clock, Tom Walker's phone rang. He looked at the screen, looked up at Ethan. It's the bank, he said. The room went quiet. Even Preacher somehow shifted on the couch. Tom answered it. He said yes and and his face was doing the thing of held stillness. And then his face changed, and Ethan had never in his life seen his father's face change, like that had never seen a change happen so quickly and so completely, and so visibly in a man who had long since learned to keep changes interior. Tom said, "Say that again, please." He listened. He said, "I understand, yes, thank you." He hung up. He looked at his hands for a moment, the slightly unsteady one, the one the fall had left him. He looked at it for long enough that Ethan was about to speak, and then Tom Walker looked up at his son, and his eyes were doing the thing they'd done this morning, full to the precise line, and holding there. "The loan's been restructured," Tom said. His voice was careful the way you're careful with something that might not survive rough handling. "New terms, lower rate. The foreclosure date is removed." He stopped. "The bank said a private arrangement had been made this morning by a third party regarding the existing debt." He looked at Mason Grayson. "You did that this morning, before you came out here." Mason said nothing. "Before you'd even seen the place," Tom said. "Before you knew if we were worth." "I knew," Mason said simply. "You knew?" Tom repeated, and his voice broke on it, just slightly, just at the edge, and he pulled it back. "How?" "Because Ethan walked off the end of a rope in a blizzard for my daughter," Mason said, "and that tells me everything I need to know about what kind of family raised him." He held Tom Walker's gaze. "I didn't need to see the place. I needed to see your son." Tom Walker put his hand flat on the table and he looked at it and he nodded once, the kind of nod that is doing a great deal of heavy structural work, holding up everything that can't be spoken. Susan Walker made a sound in the kitchen. Just one sound, small, private, and then the sound of water running, which was the signal that she was doing something with her hands, and her back was to the room, which was what Susan Walker did when she needed 30 seconds. Ethan looked at the ceiling. He blinked. He looked back down. "The interest rate going forward," Ethan said, because someone had to say practical words, or the room was going to lose its ability to function. "What is it now?" his father told him. It was less than half of what it had been. Ethan did the math in his head, the math he'd been doing in his head for 4 years. The running calculation of what was owed and what was coming in and the shrinking gap between them. He did it with the new number. He did it again because the first answer felt wrong. The gap was not shrinking anymore. The gap was not gone, not immediately. Farming was not a business that allowed for immediately, but manageable. For the first time in 4 years, the word manageable applied to the Walker family finances in a way that didn't require 3 qualifications. Okay, Ethan said. His voice was steady. He was proud of that. Yeah, his father said. Mason picked up his coffee. He looked entirely calm, which was the look of a man who had known what he was going to do since 10 o'clock this morning and had simply been waiting for the phone call to arrive as confirmation. Dutch says the hydraulics are good for another season, Mason said, redirecting to practicalities with the efficiency of someone who understands that the large emotional moment has been had and the people in the room need to be given permission to come down from it. He's also looked at the irrigation system and he's got concerns about the northeast sector. He says it needs to be addressed before spring. Tom Walker pulled himself together the way a man pulls himself together when someone gives him work to think about. How bad? Fixable, Mason said. He'll write it up. The cost. We'll work something out, Mason said. Walker, you've got equipment I can put my guys on as a training exercise. Farm equipment is different from commercial, but the principles are the same, and the practice is useful. You let Dutch work through your system as a training project. I credit that against the parts cost. Tom blinked. That's not a fair trade for you? I'll decide what's fair for me, Mason said without heat but completely. Tom Walker looked at Mason Grayson across the kitchen table, and he did the same thing that Ethan had done that morning in the hospital. He felt something land that he didn't have the right container for, yet something too large for the word gratitude, and too specific for the word luck, and too real for the word miracle. He just sat with it. He let it be large. I owe you, Tom said finally. You don't, Mason said. I promise you, you don't. Then what do I call it? Mason considered. You call it neighbors, he said. You call it what happens when people stop deciding who somebody is before they know them and he paused. Just show up. The word landed with the particular weight of a thing that has been true for a long time and is only now being named. Tom Walker looked at his son. Ethan looked back. And across the years of the farm and the barn and the beam, with the name carved in it, in the accident, in the bills, and the letter on the kitchen table, and the boy who had grown up watching his father become something different than what he'd been, and had shaped himself quietly around the new shape of things across all of it. In the warm kitchen of the Walker farmhouse on a winter afternoon, while a man named Preacher slept on the couch and Dutch's report sat on the counter, and the tractor ran clean in the barn, for the first time in 2 years, father and son looked at each other, and something passed between them that had been waiting 4 years to find the moment. Not forgiveness. There was nothing to forgive. Not relief. Too small a word. Something more like return. Something like a thing that had been pressed down and down and down, finally being allowed to rise. Ethan's phone buzzed. He looked at it. A text from a number he had added to his phone in a hospital room 2 days ago, typed with the careful deliberateness of someone whose hands were still slightly unsteady. Dutch says the tractor sounds right. My dad says you're taking the job. He didn't ask you yet officially, so ignore that if you want. Also, my dad makes hot chocolate from scratch. First frost of the year already happened, so you missed it, but there will be others. Ethan read it twice. He read the last line twice more. He put his phone in his pocket and looked at the kitchen, at his father's face, and his mother's back, and the coffee pot, and the letter that was no longer the shape of an ending, and he thought about a girl in a hospital gown pushing an IV pole through a door she'd been told to stay behind, and a girl who kept a college letter in her bag for 3 weeks because she loved her father, and a girl who kicked her boot heel against a root in the dark because she heard someone calling her name, and she needed them to know she was still there. He thought about what she'd said on the mountain. Why would you throw your whole life away out here in this for a girl you never even said hello to? He thought about the answer he'd given her. And he thought about how sitting in a warm kitchen on the other side of the worst night of his life, he understood something he hadn't quite had the words for when he'd said it, that he hadn't thrown his life away on that mountain. He'd walked toward it. He'd walked off the end of a rope into the dark and found on the other side of the dark not the ruin he'd braced for, but the thing he hadn't known he was looking for, the thing that looked like a future. He took his phone back out. He typed, "Tell him I already said yes. Also tell him about the cayenne. I want to make sure I'm there when he tries it on someone for the first time and acts like he invented it." He sent it. 3 seconds later, he absolutely will do that. Fair warning. Ethan put his phone away. He looked at his father. "The job with Grayson's shop," he said. "I'm going to take it." Tom Walker looked at his son for a moment. "Good," he said. "Spring," Ethan said. "I can start in the spring." "That works," Mason said from across the table. And the kitchen settled into the ordinary sounds of an afternoon, cups on the table, voices at a normal register, the distant sound of Dutch doing something useful in the barn. And it was so ordinary, so completely, almost aggressively ordinary, that Ethan had to sit with the strangeness of it. For a moment, the strangeness of ordinary things being allowed to be ordinary, after a very long time of everything requiring maximum effort just to hold its shape. He was sitting at the kitchen table of his family's farm. The bank letter had a new number on it. The tractor was running. His hands hurt in a way that meant they were healing. And somewhere on the other side of the county, in a house that had a beat-up recliner and 2 mugs and a tin of cayenne pepper next to the stove, a 19-year-old girl with her father's dry humor and her own particular form of courage was either sleeping or not sleeping, and either way she was warm. That was the word he kept coming back to. Warm. After the longest, coldest night of his life, the world had arrived at warm, and Ethan Walker sat in the middle of it and let himself feel it all the way through without managing it or parceling it out or deciding he didn't deserve it. He just let it be true. 3 months passed the way Montana winters pass slowly at first, then all at once. The cold held through February broke in the second week of March. And by the time April arrived, the Walker farm had that specific smell of thawed ground and possibility that Ethan had grown up associating with the beginning of the real year, the year that counted the year when everything that had been surviving through the cold got to find out if it was strong enough to grow. A lot had changed. Not all at once, not in the dramatic single-moment way that stories sometimes compress things. It changed the way real things change gradually in increments, in the small daily accumulation of things being slightly better than they were the day before. Until one morning you wake up and the math is different, and you realize it's been different for a while and you just hadn't stopped long enough to notice. The tractor ran clean. That was the first thing every morning when Ethan fired it up and the engine turned over without the sound. It had been making the sound that meant something expensive was about to become something catastrophic. He felt the absence of that sound, the way you feel the absence of a headache you'd had so long you'd forgotten it wasn't normal. Dutch had come back twice in January. Both times he'd come with his tools and his unhurried precision, and he'd work through the Walker equipment like a man filing a long overdue report, finding each problem and addressing it not quickly but correctly. And Preacher had come with him and sat with Tom Walker in the barn and talked about nothing important for hours in a way that Tom, who had been talking mostly to immediate family for 4 years, seemed to need more than he would ever say. Susan Walker had stopped taking doubles at the diner. She hadn't announced it, she'd just stopped. Ethan had noticed when 3 Tuesdays in a row she'd been home for dinner, actually home sitting at the table instead of leaving a plate covered in foil. And he hadn't said anything about it because calling attention to things his mother quietly allowed herself was not how their family worked. But he'd noticed, and it meant the numbers had shifted enough that the difference between doubles and regular shifts was the difference between barely and okay was a country Ethan had not visited in years. His hands had healed. The frost nip on his face had peeled and faded and was gone entirely by the end of January, leaving nothing behind which the doctor had said was the best outcome, and which Ethan had accepted as a kind of receipt proof that he'd gone as far as a person could go and been returned whole with nothing taken. He'd started at Mason's shop on the first Monday of March. The job was not what he'd expected, which was to say it was harder and better than he'd expected, which was usually how things that mattered turned out. It was scheduling and customer contact and the books Mason had said, and all of that was true. But what it actually was at its core was the management of 12 people who were very good at fixing things and very bad at communicating with other human beings about the status of those things. And Ethan discovered within the first week that he had a specific and apparently natural gift for translating between the world of people who understood machines and the world of people who needed machines fixed by a certain date or a certain cost, and needed someone to explain the gap between those two realities without condescension or jargon. Mason had watched him do it the first time a difficult customer, a commercial trucking outfit, whose manager had the energy of a man who was always 3 minutes late for something else, and afterward he'd said with the brevity that was his native register, "Yeah, that's the job." "I figured that out," Ethan said. "Took you 6 minutes, Mason said. "My last guy took 6 weeks. "Your last guy had other skills, probably." "He did," Mason agreed. "Not that one." The shop had 12 guys in a rhythm and a culture that Ethan had stepped into carefully, the way you step into any established community, knowing the rules were already written, and his job was to read them before he broke any. What he found was not what the town's image of Hell's Angels would have predicted. There was Preacher, who turned out to have a master's degree in mechanical engineering from a school in Colorado that he never mentioned, and which Ethan only learned about from Dutch, who mentioned it the way you mention something that should be obvious to anyone paying attention. There was Dutch, who kept 3 books going simultaneously on a reading stand in his corner of the shop, and whose actual name was David Vandermeulen, and who had been called Dutch since childhood for reasons nobody could anymore explain. There was a young guy named Cutter, who was 23, and had come to Mason's shop straight out of a situation that nobody detailed and everybody understood, and who was the fastest diagnostic mind Ethan had ever watched work, and who said approximately 11 words a day, and every one of them counted. These were not the men the town crossed the street to avoid. Or they were, and the town was simply wrong about what crossing the street meant. Ethan thought about that a lot in the first weeks. He thought about Lily saying, "I walk into a room and my name walks in before me." He thought about the way he'd felt his whole life being the poor kid, the farmer's son, the one whose father broke himself being a hero, and how the story that preceded him was never quite the whole story and was often barely even part of it. He thought about Dale Pruitt saying, "She's a Grayson on the mountain," like that was a complete sentence. And he thought about how complete sentences sometimes weren't, and how the problem with deciding you knew something was that the decision closed the door. He was thinking about that on a Thursday afternoon in April when Lily walked into the shop. She came in the front through the customer door, which meant the bell above it rang, which meant Ethan looked up from the schedule he was reviewing, and she was standing there in a jacket he hadn't seen before, her hair down, hands in her pockets, and she looked exactly like herself, which was a thing Ethan had started to notice about her, that she was always precisely herself, no more and no less, without the performance of a self that a lot of people wore in public. "Hey," she said. "Hey," he said, "you need something fixed. My dad's truck makes a sound on left turns." "You drove your dad's truck here to tell me his truck makes a sound." "He doesn't know I'm here," she said, with the particular composed quality she had when she was doing something mildly transgressive and had thought it through completely and arrived at comfortable. "I also wanted to see how the first month was going." "You could have texted. I was in the area." "Lily, we're 20 miles outside of town." She sat down in the customer chair across from his desk with the ease of someone who had decided the chair was acceptable. "How's the first month going?" Ethan put the schedule down. "Good," he said. Then, because she was the one person he'd met in recent memory who responded to good with the expression of someone who had been promised more and was waiting, actually good, not performing good, the actual thing, she nodded. "The guy's treating you okay. Preacher tried to explain diesel injection systems to me for 40 minutes on my second day." "He does that," she said. "He did that to me when I was 12. I still remember more about diesel injection than I will ever have a use for." Dutch recommended me a book. He recommends everyone a book. It's his version of hello. It was a good book. She looked at him with something in her expression that was warm and also assessing the look of someone taking inventory. "You fit here," she said. "Not as a compliment exactly, as an observation, the kind you offer when you have been thinking about something and have arrived at a conclusion and are reporting it." "I think so too," Ethan said, and the honesty of it still surprised him a little that he could say that and mean it, that a shop 20 miles out of town doing heavy equipment work was not the diminishment it might have looked like from the outside, but was in fact a place where his particular combination of skills, the calm, the translation, the understanding of machines built from years alongside them, was not just useful but necessary. That he had landed somewhere he was actually needed in the specific way he was actually built. "My dad's going to pretend he didn't know you were a good hire," Lily said. "He already does that." He told Preacher you were the best front office guy they'd had, she said. Preacher told me my dad would not tell me himself because it would undermine the thing where he acts like he was obviously right and this was never in question. He was obviously right, Ethan said. That's what he says. She agreed, dry as sand. He looked at her for a moment. In the months since the hospital, they had developed the kind of friendship that doesn't announce itself and doesn't need to, that builds in the accumulation of texts about ordinary things. And one lunch in town where they'd talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, and he'd walked her back to her car, and they'd stood in the cold for another 40 minutes talking some more, because neither of them wanted to be the one who ended it. And he'd thought about that 40 minutes a lot afterward, about the specific reluctance of it, what it named. How's the shelter? He said. Good, we had a big intake week in February, storm strays the usual. Got most of them placed. She paused. I'm training a new volunteer. Young woman 17, she's good with the scared ones too. Something flickered in her expression. I told her what you told me, on the mountain, about being the one everyone leaves behind. Ethan was very still. I didn't tell her it was you, Lily said. I just told her someone told me, and it helped, and I thought it might help her. She held his gaze. She cried, and then she went in and sat with a dog that had been refusing to eat for 3 days, and the dog ate. Ethan looked at the schedule on the desk without seeing it. Okay, he said. Yeah, Lily said. The door to the shop floor opened, and Mason Grayson came through it with grease on one hand and a look on his face that suggested he'd come to find something, and found 2 people sitting at the front desk having a conversation that stopped when he appeared, which he assessed in approximately 1 second. He looked at his daughter. Your car's outside, he said. Yep. Your car doesn't need anything fixed. Your truck makes a sound on left turns, she said. Mason looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the schedule. Left turns, Mason said. That's what she said, Ethan confirmed. Mason looked between them for a moment with the expression of a man who has decided that several things are simultaneously none of his business and entirely his business, and he hasn't yet determined which is heavier. He wiped his hand on a rag. Dutch, he said, raising his voice slightly, can you take a look at my truck? From somewhere on the shop floor, without any indication Dutch had been listening, already on my list. Mason looked at his daughter. Something in his face was working to stay neutral and not quite achieving it, and what was leaking through the not quite neutral was not displeasure. It was something warmer and more complicated than that, the expression of a man watching 2 separate things he cares about existing comfortably in the same space. Don't distract him, Mason said to Lily about Ethan. I'm a customer, Lily said. He's providing customer service. You're not a customer. I drove 20 miles. Mason left. The door to the shop floor closed behind him. Lily looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Lily. He likes you, she said. He hired me. He likes very few people he hires, she said. Dutch he likes. Preacher he likes. The rest he respects, which is different. She paused. He likes you. Ethan considered this. How can you tell? He came through that door because he heard my voice and wanted to check on me, she said. And when he saw you were here, he didn't ask me to leave. She held his gaze steadily. My dad asked people to leave rooms all the time. It's basically a hobby. He didn't ask you to leave. Ethan took that in. I should probably get back to the schedule, he said. Probably, she said. But she didn't move. One thing. Yeah. She reached into her jacket pocket and put something on the desk between them. A piece of paper folded twice the kind of folding that means something has been carried for a while, has been folded and unfolded and refolded. He looked at it without touching it. Open it, she said. He unfolded it. It was an acceptance letter. The letterhead was from the art school, and the date on it was 2 years ago. And at the top it said, we are pleased to offer you a place in our MFA program. And below that it said the word scholarship and a number. He read it. He read it again. You kept it, he said. I've been carrying it for 2 years, she said. Not because I was going, just because she stopped. Because it existed. Because somewhere there was a version of me that had been seen clearly enough to be wanted, and I needed that to exist somewhere, even if I wasn't going to go be her. She looked at the letter in his hands. I told my dad about it in the hospital. You know that part. Yeah. What you don't know, she said, is what he said. Ethan waited. He said, her voice changed quality. Just slightly took on the careful steadiness of someone reporting a thing they needed to report precisely. He said, "Baby girl, I taught you to take care of people because that's what our family does. But I failed to teach you that taking care of yourself is also taking care of the people who love you. And I'm sorry it took me this long to say that out loud." Ethan held the letter carefully. "And then he said he'd been talking to the school," Lily said. "He said he'd found out the program has a part-time option, that some students do it over 3 years instead of 2, that it's designed for people who have other obligations they're not willing to give up." She paused. "He'd already called them. Before he told me, he'd already found the option and confirmed it was available and made sure it was real before he brought it to me because he knows me. And he knew if there was any uncertainty in it, I'd use the uncertainty as a reason not to try." Ethan looked up from the letter. "Are you going to do it?" He said. "I enrolled last week," she said. He put the letter down on the desk and he looked at her and he felt something that was too large and too specific for the word proud felt it in the chest. In the place where things land that matter, that land hard, not because they're surprising, but because they're exactly right, because they're the thing that was supposed to happen, finding its way to happening. "Good," he said. His voice was rough. "Yeah," she said. "Your dad is terrified and acting like he's not," she said, "which is his most common state, so at least it's familiar." She folded the letter back up along its existing creases, the practiced folds of something handled many times. "I wanted you to know, because you were part of how I got here. Not just the mountain. The mountain started something, but the conversation started it. The one where you asked me to tell you something true." She tucked the letter back in her pocket. "Nobody had asked me to tell them something true in a long time. It turns out being asked that is it mattered." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You start in September?" he asked. "September," she confirmed. 2 evenings a week plus Saturday mornings. "I keep the shelter job. She gestured, meaning everything, meaning the life she'd built here, meaning her father and the house and the recliner and the hot chocolate on the first frost. "I keep all of it. I just add this." "That's a lot," Ethan said. "I know how to do a lot," she said simply, and there was no bravado in it, just the flat, honest assessment of a person who has been doing a lot for a long time and has only recently been given permission to point that out as a qualification rather than a complaint. The bell above the front door rang. 2 customers came in, a farming couple, the husband holding a parts order form and the wife holding her phone with a question already loading on her face, and Lily stood from the chair with the easy, unhurried movement of someone who had said the thing she'd come to say and was complete. "I'll let you work," she said. "Left turns," Ethan said. She stopped. "Tell your dad I said the left turn sound is probably the wheel bearing," he said. "Dutch will confirm it, but that's my read. Tell him I said he should have had it looked at a month ago." She looked at him. "How do you know he should have had it looked at a month ago?" "Because your dad is the kind of man who notices a problem and files it away and tells himself he'll get to it when things slow down," Ethan said. "And things don't slow down." Sound familiar? A beat. "I'll tell him," she said. She left. Ethan turned to the farming couple and said, "What can I help you with?" And they told him and he told them, and the afternoon moved. The way afternoons at the shop moved, full and purposeful and punctuated by the sounds of 12 people doing work they were good at, and the wheel bearing on Mason Grayson's truck was diagnosed by Dutch at 4:15, and Ethan sent Mason a text that said, "Left front wheel bearing," like I said, and got back a text that was just a single period, which he had learned in the last month was Mason's version of, "You're probably right, but I'm not going to say that directly." He drove home that evening in the truck that still made the sound on left turns, but now the sound had a name and a repair date and a cost he could plan for, and the difference between a nameless problem and a named one was in Ethan Walker's experience almost everything. His father was on the porch when he pulled up. This was new. Tom Walker had been getting to the porch in the last few weeks, had been navigating the steps with the cane and sitting in the cold for an hour in the afternoon, which the physical therapist he'd finally agreed to see had recommended, and which Tom had implemented without comment, the way he implemented most things that were good for him quietly, without making a production of the fact that he was doing something his body had said no to for a long time. He was sitting in the old rocker with a coffee, and he looked at Ethan getting out of the truck, and he said, "Good day." "Good day," Ethan said. "Lily came by the shop." Ethan looked at him. How did you? Mason texted your mother, Tom said with the air of someone delivering information he finds mildly entertaining. They text now. I don't know when that started. Ethan stood at the bottom of the porch steps and processed this information. Mason Grayson texts my mother. About twice a week, Tom said. She doesn't tell me what about. I don't ask. He paused. She smiles at her phone, though. Mom smiles at her phone. She does now. Ethan climbed the porch steps and leaned against the rail and looked at his father in the rocking chair. And the evening was cold, but not winter cold, the edge of spring cold that has the smell of eventual warmth in it, and the light was the long, low amber of April at 6 o'clock. And his father looked older than he'd looked before the accident and more at peace than he'd looked in the 4 years since it. And Ethan thought that sometimes more at peace was what healing looked like. Not the return of what was lost, but the arrival of something the loss had made room for. She enrolled in school, Ethan said. Lily, the art program. Tom nodded. He'd known this too, somehow or part of it. The Grayson Walker Communication Network had apparently developed in ways Ethan was still mapping. Good, Tom said. Part-time, she keeps everything else. Good, Tom said again. Then you like her. Ethan looked at the fields. Yeah. More than like her, probably. Dad. I'm not saying do anything about it, Tom said mildly. I'm saying I've got eyes. I've had eyes for 20 years. I know what my son looks like when he's thinking about someone. He rocked the chair slightly. I'm just making a note. Noted, Ethan said. Your grandfather, Tom said. And Ethan looked at him because when Tom started a sentence with your grandfather, it was always heading somewhere worth following. Met your grandmother because he fixed her fence. She had a broken fence he was passing by. He stopped and fixed it. She came out and asked why he'd done it, and he said, because it was broken and he knew how to fix it. Tom paused. They were married 43 years. Ethan was quiet. I'm just saying, Tom said. Sometimes the thing that starts it is simple. A blizzard isn't simple, Ethan said. No, Tom agreed. But the reason you went in was, he looked at his son. You went in because she was alone and you knew how that felt. That's pretty simple. Ethan looked at his hands. They'd healed completely, no lasting damage, nothing the cold had been able to keep. He flexed them, both of them, and felt the ordinary miracle of that. Tell me something, he said. When you went in 4 years ago for the neighbor's kid, were you scared? Tom Walker stopped rocking. He held the stillness, for a moment, the way he held things he was being precise about. Terrified, he said. But you went. Of course I went. Because of the barn, Ethan said. Because of what Grandpa built you. Tom looked at him, something sharp and clear in his face. What do you mean? He built you something, Ethan said slowly, working it out as he said it, the thing he'd been circling for months. The barn, the way he did things, the way he taught you to do things. He built you a shape, a way of being. And when you got to that moment, the moment with the neighbor's kid in the storm, you didn't decide what to do. You just were what you'd been built to be. He paused. And then you built me the same way. And when I got to my moment, I didn't decide either. I just were what you were, Tom Walker said. Were what you made me, Ethan said. The porch was very quiet. Tom Walker put his coffee down on the rail, and he looked at his son for a long moment, and whatever was in his face went past the line this time, didn't hold at the edge, came over it briefly, completely, and without apology. I broke the farm, Tom said. I know I did. I went in after that boy, and I came out wrong, and I broke the farm, and I broke the plan, and he stopped. I've been carrying that. I know, Ethan said. I need you to hear something, Tom said. I need you to hear it clearly. He waited until Ethan was looking at him directly. I would do it again. Every time. 100 times. I would go in after that boy 100 times and come out wrong 100 times because the alternative is a boy divided alone in the cold, and I cannot be the man who does nothing about that. He held Ethan's gaze. And I raised you the same way. And you went into that blizzard for a girl you'd never spoken to, and you could have died and you didn't, and she's alive and you're here. His voice was completely steady now, completely certain. I am not sorry for 1 second of what I built you to be. Not one. Ethan Walker was 20 years old and standing on his family's porch in April, And his father was looking at him like that, and he had nowhere to put what he was feeling except to just feel it, all of it, in the open without management. Okay, he said. Okay, his father said. They sat with the evening, and then because they were Walker men, and Walker men did not marinate in emotion when there was something practical available, Tom said, Mason's coming Saturday. What for? He wants to look at the Northeast irrigation. Dutch already looked at it. Dutch told him something. Mason wants to see it himself. Tom picked up his coffee. He also wants to show you something. He didn't say what. He told your mother, and your mother didn't tell me. Ethan looked at the barn. The light was hitting the front of it exactly the way his grandfather had planned the last of the evening, gold coming in level and warm on the old boards. You know what he wants to show me, Ethan said. Probably, Tom said. Let him show you himself. Saturday arrived clear and cold and perfect, and Mason came alone this time. Just him. No trucks following, which itself meant something about how things had shifted in the months since the hospital, the way a thing that starts formal and careful relaxes into something that doesn't need ceremony. He shook Tom's hand on the porch. He accepted coffee from Susan. He talked to Tom for 20 minutes about the irrigation system with the specific engagement of a man who genuinely finds these things interesting and has no separation between personal and professional investment in a problem worth solving. And then he said to Ethan, walk with me. They went to the barn. Mason went to the back corner without needing to be directed, without asking which corner. Which meant he'd been thinking about it since Ethan had told him, had mapped the barn in his mind from a description, and arrived now knowing where he was going. He looked at the beam, at the name carved there, Walker's. He stood there for a long moment, hands in his pockets, looking at it the way you look at something you came specifically to look at and want to look at correctly without rushing. I want to show you something, and he said. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a photograph, handed it to Ethan. It was an old photo printed on the kind of paper photographs used to be printed on the slightly thick stock with the white border. A man Ethan didn't recognize, young, maybe 30, standing in front of what was clearly an early version of a building that Ethan did recognize. The shop, 30 years younger and considerably smaller, but the bones of it were the same. My father, Mason said. That's the shop the day he opened it, 1987. He built the front section himself. Him and 2 other guys. Took them a summer. Ethan looked at the photograph, at the young man in it who had Mason's jaw and Mason's posture, and was grinning at the camera with the particular grin of someone who has just finished a large and difficult thing. He died when Lily was 4, Mason said, before he could see her be who she is. He paused. I took over the shop. I built the back section myself. Same guys, we were older. Another summer. He looked at the beam. I didn't carve anything. I thought about it, decided against it. He paused. I've been thinking about that decision ever since I heard about this beam. Ethan held the photograph carefully. Why did you decide against it? He said. I thought it was ego, Mason said. Your grandfather. He stopped, reconsidered. Your grandfather understood something I didn't. He understood that building something isn't ego. It's a statement. It's a promise. It says, I was here. I made this. It's real. He looked at the carving. After Lily told me about this beam, I went back to the shop, and I stood in the back section and thought about whether I wanted to carve something. Ethan waited. And then I thought about what I'd carve, Mason said. And I realized I didn't want to carve just my name. I wanted to carve something that was bigger than me. He took the photograph back, looked at it. I haven't done it yet. I haven't figured out the right word. He put the photo away. But I thought you should know, he said, that your grandfather's beam changed the way I think about something I built. And that means it's still doing work. 30 years after he put his hands on it, it's still doing work in people's heads. He looked at Ethan. Things built right do that. They outlast the building. Ethan looked at the beam, at his family's name in the old man's handwriting. I think, he said slowly, the word you're looking for is Grayson's. Mason went still. Just that, Ethan said, just the name, same as he did. Because the name is the whole thing. It's everyone who carries it and everyone who will. It doesn't need anything else. The barn was completely quiet. Mason looked at the beam for a long time. Yeah, he said. His voice was very quiet. Yeah, that's it. They walked back to the farmhouse, and Tom Walker was off the porch and standing near the fence, which was the farthest he'd been from the house without the cane in 2 years. And he was standing there because Preacher had called Mason's phone from the road to say he was coming by, just passing through. And he'd appeared at the gate with Dutch, and Dutch had the look of a man who had been thinking about the Northeast irrigation problem and had arrived at a theory he needed to test. And there was a moment, just a moment, where Ethan stood back and looked at his family's farm with all these people moving around on it. His father standing at the fence in the spring air, his mother at the door, Dutch and Preacher and Mason in the barn behind them, and the fields around them, and the sky above them, the particular blue that Montana spring makes before it decides to fully commit. And what he felt was not gratitude exactly. It was something older and quieter than gratitude. It was the feeling of things being right, of the shape of things having finally arrived at the shape they were supposed to be. Not perfect, not finished, but right. His phone buzzed. Lily, my dad texted me a picture of your barn. Why is he at your barn? Ethan, walking the property. Lily, he goes to your barn more than he goes to the grocery store. Ethan, the barn has better problems. Lily, I am coming Sunday. My dad doesn't know. Don't tell him. Ethan, what's on Sunday? A pause, then first frost is over. But I owe you hot chocolate, cayenne and everything. I've been practicing. Ethan stood in his family's yard in April and read that text and looked at the barn and the fields and the people moving through the day, and he thought about a night in February that had seemed like the end of everything and had turned out to be the beginning of something he didn't have a name for yet, something that was still becoming, still building itself beam by beam, the way his grandfather had built the barn, slowly, surely, without hurrying, trusting the work. He typed back, Sunday works, and he put his phone in his pocket and walked across the yard toward his father, toward the people who had come to stand with his family, toward the barn that still had his name in the back corner on the oldest beam, toward the next thing, and the thing after that, and all the things that were still ahead, and he didn't look back at the storm. He didn't need to. A farm boy who walked into a blizzard as nobody had walked out, as the man who understood finally and completely that who you are is not what you own, not what the town says, not the boots you wear, or the name above the door, or the letter from the bank. It's what you do when the rope runs out and the wind is loudest and there is nothing left but the choice to stay at the door or to go off the end of it into the dark after the one person who stopped believing anyone was coming. That's who Ethan Walker was. That's who Tom Walker had built him to be. And that was something no storm, no bank, no opinion of any town in Montana could ever take away.